Chapter 18 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 18. Ned's new profession pays admirably. He and Tom wax philosophical. Pat comes for a landscape of himself. Lynch Law and the Doctors, Ned's Sitters, a Yankee swell receives a gentle rebuff. The ups and downs and the outs and ins of life are, as every one is aware, exceedingly curious, sometimes pleasant, often the reverse, and not infrequently abrupt. On the day of their arrival at the settlement, Ned and Tom were almost beggars, $1 or two being all the cash they possessed, besides the gold dust swallowed by the latter, which being, as Tom remarked, sunk money, was not available for present purposes. 1 week later they were, as Abel Jefferson expressed it, "driving a roaring trade in pictures," and in the receipt of $50, or £10 a day. Goods and provisions of all kinds had been suddenly thrown into the settlement by speculators, so that living became comparatively cheap. Several new and profitable diggings had been discovered, in consequence of which gold became plentiful, and the result of all was that Edward Sinton, Esquire, portrait and landscape painter, had more orders than he could accept, at almost any price he chose to name. Men who every Saturday came into the settlement to throw away their hard-earned gains in the gambling houses, or to purchase provisions for the campaign of the following week, were delighted to have an opportunity of procuring their portraits, and were willing to pay any sum for them, so that, had our hero been so disposed, he could have fleeced the miners to a considerable extent. But Ned was not so disposed, either by nature or necessity. He fixed what he considered fair remunerative prices for his work, according to the tariff of the diggings, and so arranged it that he made as much per day as he would have realised had he been the fortunate possessor of one of the best claims in the neighbourhood. Tom Collins meanwhile went out prospecting, and speedily discovered a spot of ground which, when wrought with the pan, turned him in $20 a day, so that in the course of a fortnight our adventurers found themselves comparatively rich men. This was satisfactory, and Ned admitted as much one morning to Tom, as he sat on a 3-legged stool in his studio, i.e. a dilapidated log hut, preparing for a sitter, while the latter was busily engaged in concluding his morning repast of damper, pork, and beans. "There's no doubt about it, Tom," said he, pegging a sheet of drawing paper to a flat board. "We are rapidly making our fortunes, my boy. But do you know, I'm determined to postpone that desirable event, and take to rambling again." "There you go," said Tom, somewhat testily, as he lit a cigar, and lay down on his bed to enjoy it. "You are never content. I knew it wouldn't last. You're a rolling stone, and will end in being a beggar. Do you really mean to say that you intend to give up a lucrative profession and become a vagrant? For such you will be, if you take to wandering about the country without any object in view." "Indeed I do," answered Ned. "How often am I to tell you that I don't, and won't, consider the making of money the chief good of this world? Doubtless it is an uncommonly necessary thing, especially to those who have families to support, but I am firmly convinced that this life was meant to be enjoyed, and I mean to enjoy it accordingly." "I agree with you, Ned, heartily. But if every one enjoyed life as you propose to do, and took to rambling over the face of the earth, there would be no work done, and nothing could be had for love or money, except what grew spontaneously, and that would be a joyful state of things, wouldn't it?" Tom Collins, indulging the belief that he had taken up an unassailable position, propelled from his lips a long thin cloud of smoke, and smiled through it at his friend. "Your style of reasoning is rather wild, to say the least of it," answered Ned, as he rubbed down his colours on the bottom of a broken plate. "In the first place, you assume that I propose to spend all my life in rambling, and, in the second place, you found your argument on the absurd supposition that everybody else must find their sole enjoyment in the same occupation." "How I wish," sighed Tom Collins, smoking languidly, "that there was no such thing as reasoning. You would be a much more agreeable fellow, Ned, if you didn't argue." "It takes two to make an argument," remarked Ned. "Well, but couldn't you converse without arguing?" "Certainly, if you would never contradict what I say, nor make an incorrect statement, nor draw a wrong conclusion, nor object to being contradicted when I think you're in the wrong." Tom sighed deeply and drew comfort from his cigar. In a few minutes he resumed. "Well, but what do you mean by enjoying life?" Ned Sinton pondered the question a few seconds, and then replied, "I mean this. The way to enjoy life is to do all the good you can, by working just enough to support yourself and your family, if you have one, to assist in spreading the gospel, and to enable you to help a friend in need, and to alleviate the condition of the poor, the sick, and the destitute. To work for more than this is to be greedy. To work for less is to be reprehensibly lazy. This amount of work being done, men ought to mingle with their fellow creatures, and wander abroad as much as may be among the beautiful works of their Creator." "A very pretty theory, doubtless," replied Tom; "but pray in what manner will your proposed ramble advance the interests of religion, or enable you to do the extraordinary amount of good you speak of?" "There you go again, Tom. You ask me the abstract question, what do you mean by enjoying life, and when I reply you object to the answer as not being applicable to the present case. Of course it is not. I did not intend it to be. The good I mean to do in my present ramble is chiefly, if not solely, to my own body and mind." "Stop, my dear fellow," interrupted Tom. "Don't become energetic. I accept your answer to the general question. But how many people think you can afford to put your theory in practice?" "Very, very few," replied Ned, earnestly; "but that does not affect the truth of my theory. Men will toil night and day to accumulate gold, until their bodies and souls are incapable of enjoying the good things which gold can purchase, and they are infatuated enough to plume themselves on this account as being diligent men of business, while others, alas! are compelled thus to toil in order to procure the bare necessaries of life. But these melancholy facts do not prove the principle of grind and toil to be a right one, much less do they constitute a reason for my refusing to enjoy life in the right way when I have the power." Tom made no reply, but the vigorous puffs from his cigar seemed to indicate that he pondered these things deeply. A few minutes afterwards Ned's expected sitter entered. He was a tall, burly Irishman, with a red flannel shirt open at the neck, a pair of huge long boots, and a wide awake. "The top of the morning to yees," said the man, pulling off his hat as he entered. "Good morning, friend," said Ned, as Tom Collins rose, shouldered his pick and shovel, and left the hut. "You are punctual, and deserve credit for so good a quality. Pray sit down." "Faix, then, I don't know what a quality is, but av it's a good thing, I've no objection," replied the man, taking a seat on the edge of the bed which Tom had just vacated. "I was wantin' to ax ye, sir, if you could put in me pick and shovel in the landscape." "In the landscape, Pat!" exclaimed Ned, addressing his visitor by the generic name of the species. "I thought you wanted a portrait." "Troth, then, I don't know which it is you call it, but I wants a picture o' myself all over, from the top o' me hat to the sole o' me boots." "Isn't that a landscape?" "No, it's a portrait." "Then it's a portrait I wants, and if you'll put in the pick and shovel, I'll give you $2 a pace for them." "I'll put them in, Pat, for nothing," replied Ned, smiling, as he commenced his sketch. "I suppose you intend to send this to some fair one in old Ireland?" Pat did not reply at once. "Sure," said he, slowly, "I niver thought of her in that way before, but maybe she was fair once, though she's been a'most as black as a bog oak for half a century. It's for me grandmother I want it." "Your grandmother? That's curious, now. The last man I painted meant to send the likeness to his mother." "Not so curious, neither," replied the man, with some feeling. "It's my opinion the farther a man goes from the old country, and the rougher he becomes with scraping up and down through the world, the more tinder his heart gets when he thinks o' his mother. Me own mother died when I was a bit spalpeen, and I lived with me grandmother, bliss her heart, ever since, at laist till I took to wanderin', which was 10 years past." "So long? Pat, you must have wandered far in that time. Have you ever been away far into the interior of this country, among the mountains, in the course of your wanderings?" "Among the mountains, is it? Indade I have, just, and a most tremendous beautiful sight it is. Was ye goin' there?" "I've been thinking about it. Is the shooting good?" "Shootin', ah! If you'd been with me and Bill Simmons 2 summers ago, you'd have had more nor enough o' shooting. The grizzlies are thick as peas, and the buffaloes swarm in the valleys like mosquitoes, not to mention wolves and beavers, and badgers and deer, and sich like. For, by the Red Injuns, we shot 6 o' them critters about the legs and arms in self-defence, and they shot us too. They put an arrow dane through the point o' Bill's nose, and one ripped up me left arm, it did." Pat bared the brawny limb, and exhibited the wound as he spoke. "Shootin', is it? Faix, there's the hoight o' shootin' there, and no end o' scenery." The conversation was interrupted at this point by the door being burst violently open, and several men rushing into the hut. They grasped the Irishman by the arms and attempted to drag him out, but Pat seized hold of the plank on the edge of which he sat, and refused to move at first. "Come along, boy," cried one boisterously. "We're goin' to lynch a doctor, and we want you to swear to him." "Ay, and to swear at him too, if you like. He's a rig'lar cheat. Been killin' us off by the dozen as cool as you like, and pretendin' to be an M.D. all the time." "There's more than one," cried another man, seizing Pat again by the arm. "Won't you come, man?" "Och, of course I will. If it's to do any good to the public, I'm your man. Hooray for the people, and down with the aristocracy." This sentiment was received with a shout of delight, and several exclamations of "Bah!" as the party hurried in a body from the studio. Ned, having thus nothing to do, rose and followed them towards the centre of the settlement, where a large crowd was collecting to try the unhappy doctors above referred to. There were 6 of them, all disreputable looking rascals, who had set up for doctors, and had carried on a thriving business among the sick miners, of whom there were many at that time, until a genuine doctor arrived at the place and discovered and exposed them. The miners were fortunately not bloodthirsty at this time, so the 6 self-dubbed M.D.s, instead of being hanged, were banished for ever from the settlement. Half an hour later the miners were busy in their respective claims, and Ned Sinton was again seated before his "landscape" of the Irishman. Just as he was completing the sketch, the door opened slowly, and a very remarkable man swaggered into the room, and spat on the centre of the floor. He was dressed in the extreme of the fashion then prevalent in the Eastern States, a superfine black coat, silk vest, superfine black trousers, patent leather boots, kid gloves, and a black silk hat. A more unnatural apparition at the diggings could not well be imagined. Ned Sinton could hardly credit his eyes, but no rubbing of them would dispel the vision. There he stood, a regular Broadway swell, whose love of change had induced him to seek his fortune in the gold regions of California, and whose vanity had induced him to retain his drawing-room costume. This man, besides being possessed of a superabundance of supercilious impudence, also possessed a set of digging tools, the handles of which were made of polished oak and walnut, with bright brass ferrules. With these he proposed to dig his fortune in a leisurely way. Meanwhile, finding the weather rather hot, he had made up his mind to have his portrait done. Thrusting his hands into his pockets, this gentleman shut the door with his heel, turned his back to the fireplace, from the mere force of habit, for there was no fire, and again spat upon the floor, after which he said, "I say, stranger, what's your charge for a likeness?" "You will excuse me, sir," answered Ned, "if before replying to that question I beg of you not to spit on my floor." The Yankee uttered an exclamation of surprise, and asked, "Why not, stranger?" "Because I don't like it." "You wouldn't have me spit in my hat, would you?" inquired the dandy. "Certainly not." "Where then?" Ned pointed to a large wooden box, which stood close to the fireplace, and said, "There. I have provided a box for the accommodation of those sitters who indulge in that disagreeable practice. If you can't avoid spitting, do it there." "Well, now, you Britishers are strange critters. But you haven't told me your price for a portrait." "I fear that I cannot paint you at any price," replied Ned, without looking up from his paper, while Pat listened to the conversation with a comical leer on his broad countenance. "Why not, stranger?" asked the dandy, in surprise. "Because I'm giving up business, and don't wish to take any more orders." "Then I'll set here, I guess, and look at you while you knock off that one," said the man, sitting down close to Ned's elbow, and again spitting on the floor. Whether he did so intentionally or not we cannot tell. Probably not, but the effect upon Ned was so strong that he rose deliberately, opened the door, and pointed to the passage thus set free without uttering a word. His look, however, was quite sufficient. The dandy rose abruptly and walked out in silence, leaving Ned to shut the door quietly behind him and return to his work, while the Irishman rolled in convulsions of laughter on Tom Collins's bed. Ned's sitters, as we have hinted, were numerous and extremely various. Sometimes he was visited by sentimental and homesick miners, and occasionally by dandy miners, such as we have described; but his chief customers were the rough, hearty men from Old England, Old Ireland, and from the Western States, with all of whom he had many a pleasant and profitable hour's conversation, and from many of whom, especially the latter, he obtained valuable and interesting information in reference to the wild regions of the interior which he longed so much to see. Chapter 18. Chapter 19 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 19. The Wilderness Again, a Splendid Valley, Gigantic Trees and Waterfalls. Tom meets with an accident. Both meet with many surprises. Mysteries, caverns, doleful sounds, and grizzly bear catchers. Mounted on gallant steeds, Ned and his friend again appear in the wilderness in the afternoon of a beautiful autumn day. They had ridden far that day. Dust covered their garments, and foam bespattered the chests of their horses, but the spirits of men and beasts were not yet subdued, for their muscles by long practice were inured to hardship. Many days had passed since they left the scene of their recent successful labours, and many a weary league had been traversed over the unknown regions of the interior. They were lost, in one sense of that term, charmingly, romantically lost. That is to say, neither Ned nor Tom had the most distant idea of where they were, or what they were coming to, but both of them carried pocket compasses, and they knew that by appealing to these, and to the daily jotting of the route they had travelled, they could ascertain pretty closely the direction that was necessary to be pursued in order to strike the great San Joaquin River. Very different was the scenery through which they now rode from that of the northern diggings. The most stupendous and magnificent mountains in the world surrounded on all sides the valley through which they passed, giving to it an air of peaceful seclusion. Yet it was not gloomy, for the level land was broad and fertile, and so varied in aspect that it seemed as though a beautiful world were enclosed by those mighty hills. Large tracts of the valley were covered with wild oats and rich grass, affording excellent pasturage for the deer that roamed about in large herds. Lakes of various sizes sustained thousands of wildfowl on their calm breasts, and a noble river coursed down its entire length. Oaks, chestnuts, and cypresses grew in groups all over the landscape, and up on the hillsides firs of gigantic size reared their straight stems high above the surrounding trees. But the point in the scenery which struck the travellers as being most peculiar was the precipitous character of the sides of many of the vast mountains, and the flatness of their summits. Tom Collins, who was a good judge of heights, having travelled in several mountainous regions of the world, estimated the nearest precipices to be upwards of 3,000 feet, without a break from top to bottom, but the ranges in the background towered far above these, and must have been at least double. "I never saw anything like this before, Tom," said Ned, in a suppressed voice. "I did not believe such sublime scenery existed," replied his companion. "I have travelled in Switzerland and Norway, but this surpasses both. Truly, it was worth while to give up our gold digging in order to see this." "Yet there are many," rejoined Ned, "who travel just far enough into California to reach the diggings, where they remain till their fortunes are made, or till their hopes are disappointed, and then they return to England and write a book, perchance, in which they speak as authoritatively as if they had swept the whole region, north and south, east and west. Little wonder that we find such travellers contradicting each other flatly. One speaks of California as being the most splendid agricultural country in the world, and advises every one to emigrate at once, while another condemns it as an arid, unproductive region fit only for the support of Indians and grizzly bears, the fact being that both speak, correctly enough it may be, of the very small portion of California they have respectively visited. Why, the more I travel in this wonderful land, the more I feel how very little I know about it, and had I returned to England without having seen this valley, I should have missed one of the most remarkable sights, not only in the country, but I verily believe in the world. If you ever return home, Tom, and are persuaded, at the earnest request of numerous friends, to write a book, don't dogmatize as to facts. Remember how limited your experience has been, and don't forget that facts in one valley are not facts at all in another valley 8 or 10 miles off. Perhaps, suggested Tom Collins, patting the arched neck of his steed, perhaps the advice with which you have just favoured me might, with greater propriety, have proceeded from me to you, for, considering the copious variety of your sentiments on this and other subjects, and the fluency with which you utter them, it is likely that you will rush into print long before I timidly venture, with characteristic modesty, even to grasp the pen. As Tom ceased speaking, they came upon a forest of pine or fir trees, in the midst of which towered a tree of such gigantic height that its appearance caused them simultaneously to draw up and gaze at it in silent wonder. "Can it be possible," said Ned, "that our eyes don't deceive us? Surely some peculiarity in the atmosphere gives that tree false proportions." Without answering, Tom galloped towards the tree in question, closely followed by his friend. Instead of any delusive haze being cleared away, however, the tree grew larger as they approached, and when they halted about 20 yards from it, they felt that they were indeed in the presence of the monarch of the forest. The tree, which they measured, after viewing it in wondering admiration from all points of view, was 93 feet in circumference, and it could not have been less than 360 feet high. They little knew that many years afterwards the bark of this giant tree, to the height of 116 feet, was to be removed to England, built up in its original form, and exhibited in the great crystal palace of Sydenham. Yet so it was, and part of the mother of the forest may be seen there at this day. Towards evening the travellers drew near to the head of the valley. "We must be approaching a waterfall, of no ordinary size," remarked Tom, as they rode through the dark shades of the forest, which were pretty extensive there. "I have heard its roar for some time," answered Ned, "but until we clear this belt of trees we shan't see it." Just then the roar of the fall burst upon them with such deafening violence that they involuntarily started. It seemed as if a mighty torrent had burst its bounds, and was about to sweep them away, along with the forest through which they rode. Pressing forward in eager haste, they soon found that their having doubled round a huge mountain barrier, which the trees had hitherto concealed from them, was the cause of the sudden increase in the roar of the fall, but they were still unable to see it, owing to the dense foliage that overshadowed them. As they galloped on, the thunder of falling waters became more deep and intense, until they reached an elevated spot, comparatively free from trees, which overlooked the valley, and revealed a sight such as is not equalled even by Niagara itself. A succession of wall-like mountains rose in 2 tiers before them, literally into the clouds, for several of the lower clouds floated far below the highest peaks, and from the summit of the highest range a river, equal to the Thames at Richmond, dropped sheer down a fall of above 2,000 feet. Here it met the summit of the lower mountain range, on which it burst with a deep-toned, sullen, never-ceasing roar, comparable only to eternal thunder. A white cloud of spray received the falling river in its soft embrace, and sent it forth again, turbulent and foam-bespeckled, towards its second leap, another 1,000 feet, into the plain below. The entire height of the fall was above 3,000 feet. Its sublimity no language can convey. Its irresistible effect on the minds of the wanderers was to turn their thoughts to the Almighty Creator of so awe-inspiring and wonderful a scene. Here they discovered another tree, which was so large that their thoughts were diverted even from the extraordinary cataract for a short time. Unlike the previous one, this monarch of the woods lay prostrate on the ground, but its diameter near the root was so great that they could not see over it though seated on horseback. It measured 120 feet in circumference, and when standing must have been little, if at all, short of 500 feet in height. Surrounded as they were by such noble and stupendous works of God, the travellers could not find words to express their feelings. Deep emotion has no articulate language. The heaving breast and the glowing eye alone indicate the fervour of the thoughts within. For a long time they sat gazing round them in silent wonder and admiration. Then they dismounted to measure the great tree, and after that Ned sat down to sketch the fall, while his companion rode forward to select a spot for camping on. Tom had not proceeded far when he came upon the track of wheels in the grass, a sight which surprised him much, for into that remote region he had supposed few travellers ventured, even on horseback. The depth and breadth of the tracks, too, surprised him not a little. They were much deeper and broader than those caused by any species of cart he had yet seen or heard of in the country, and the width apart was so great that he began to suspect he must have mistaken a curious freak of nature for the tracks of a gigantic vehicle. Following the track for some distance, he came to a muddy spot where the footprints of men and horses became distinctly visible. A little further on he passed the mouth of what appeared to be a cavern, and, being of an inquisitive disposition, he dismounted and tied his horse to a tree, intending to examine the entrance. To enter a dark cave in a wild, unknown region, with the din of a thundering cataract filling the ears, just after having discovered tracks of a mysterious nature in the neighbourhood, was so trying to Tom's nervous system that he half resolved to give it up. But the exploration of a cavern has a fascination to some dispositions which every one cannot understand. Tom said "Pshaw!" to himself in an undertone, and, boldly stepping into the dark portals of the cavern, he disappeared. Meanwhile, Edward Sinton finished his sketch, and, supposing that Tom was waiting for him in advance, he mounted and galloped forward as fast as the nature of the ground would allow. Soon he came to the tracks before mentioned, and shortly after to the muddy spot with the footprints. Here he drew rein and dismounted to examine the marks more closely. Our hero was as much perplexed as his friend had been at the unusually broad tracks of the vehicle which had passed that way. Leading his horse by the bridle, he advanced slowly until he came to the spot where Tom's horse stood fastened to a tree, a sight which alarmed him greatly, for the place was not such as any one would have selected for an encampment. Yet, had any foul play befallen his friend, he knew well that the horse would not have been left quietly there. Sorely puzzled, and filled with anxious fears, he examined the spot carefully, and at last came upon the entrance to the cavern, before which he paused, uncertain what to do. The shadows of evening were fast falling on the scene, and he experienced a feeling of dread as he gazed into the profound gloom. He was convinced that Tom must be there, but the silence, and the length of time he had been absent, led him to fear that some accident had befallen his friend. "Ho! Tom!" he shouted on entering. "Are you there?" There was a rolling echo within, but no voice replied to the question. Again Ned shouted at the full pitch of his lungs, and this time he thought he heard a faint reply. Hurrying forward eagerly, as quickly as he dared, he repeated his shout, but the declivity of the entrance became so great that he lost his footing, and well nigh fell headlong down a steep incline. He succeeded, however, in regaining his hold, and clambered back to the entrance as quickly as possible. Here he caught up a pine knot, struck a light and kindled it, and, with this torch held high above his head, advanced once more into the cavern. The voice of Tom Collins at this moment came loud and full from the interior. "Take care, Ned, there's a sharp descent. I've tumbled down it, but I don't think I'm much hurt." "Cheer up, my boy," cried Ned heartily. "I'll get you out in a minute." The next moment he stood beside his friend, who had risen from the rugged floor of the cave, and sat on a piece of rock, resting his head on his hand. "Are you badly hurt, my poor fellow?" said Ned, anxiously, going down on one knee, and endeavouring to raise his friend's head. "I fear you are. Here, try a drop of this brandy. That's it. Why, you look better already. Come now, let me examine you." The spirit revived Tom at once, and he replied cheerfully, as he submitted to inspection, "All right. I was only stunned a little by the fall. Catch me exploring again without a light." On examination, Ned found to his great relief that his friend's hurts were slight. He had been stunned by the severity of his fall, but no bones were broken, and only a few scratches received, so that after another sip of brandy he felt almost as well as ever. But he firmly resisted his companion's entreaty to leave the cavern. "No, my boy," said he, "after paying such a price as entrance fee, I'm not going to quit until I have explored the whole of this cave, so please go out for another pine knot or two, and I'll wait for you." Seeing that he was determined, Ned obeyed, and soon returned with several fresh torches, 2 of which were ignited, and a bright light sent far and wide into the roof of the cave, which was at a great height above them. The walls were of curious, and in some places grotesque forms. Immense stalactites hung from the roof, and these were of varied colours, pale green, pink, and white, while some of them looked like cascades which sprang from the walls, and had been petrified ere they quite reached the ground. The roof was supported by natural pillars, and various arched openings led into similar chambers, some of which were larger and more curious than the outer one. "Do you know," said Ned Sinton, as they sat down on a rock in one of the inner chambers to rest, "this place recalls vividly to my remembrance a strange dream which I had just before leaving England." "Indeed," said Tom. "I hope you're not a believer in dreams. Don't, I beseech you, take it into your head that it's going to be realised at this particular moment, whatever it was. It would take a very strong amount of belief indeed to induce me to expect the realisation of that dream. Shall I tell it to you?" "Is it a very ghostly one?" inquired Tom. "No, not at all." "Then out with it." Ned immediately began the narration of the remarkable dream with which this story opens, and as he went on to tell of how the stout old gentleman snuffed gold dust, and ultimately shot up to the roof of the cave and became a golden stalactite, Tom Collins, whose risible tendencies were easily roused, roared with laughter until the vaulted caverns echoed again. At the end of one of these explosions the 2 friends were struck dumb by certain doleful and mysterious sounds which proceeded from the further end of the inmost chamber. In starting to his feet, Tom Collins let fall his torch, and in the convulsive clutch which he made to catch it, he struck the other torch out of Ned's hand, so that instantly both were left in the profoundest darkness, with their hearts beating like sledge-hammers against their ribs. To flee was their first and natural impulse, but to flee in the dark, over rough ground, and with very imperfect ideas as to the position of the cave's outlet, was dangerous. "What is to be done?" ejaculated Tom Collins, in a tone that indicated the perturbation of his heart too clearly. At that moment Ned remembered that he had a box of matches in the pocket of his hunting coat, so, without answering, he drew it forth, struck a light, and reignited the torches. "Now, Tom," he said, "don't let us give way to unmanly fears. I have no belief whatever in ghosts or spirits, good or evil, being permitted to come in visible or audible form to frighten poor mortals. Every effect has a cause, and I'm determined to find out the cause of these strange sounds. They certainly proceed from animal lungs; whether from man or beast remains to be seen." "Go ahead, then, I'll follow," said Tom, whose courage had returned with the light. "I'm game for anything that I can see, but I confess to you that I cannot stand howls and groans and darkness." Notwithstanding their utmost efforts, they failed to discover the cause of the mysterious sounds, which seemed at times to be voices muttering, while at other times they swelled out into a loud cry. All that could be certainly ascertained was, that they proceeded from the roof of the innermost cavern, and that the centre of that roof was too high to be discerned by torchlight. "What shall we do now?" inquired Tom. "We shall go to the summit of the hill above this cave, and see what is to be seen there. Always look at both sides of a mystery if you would fathom it. Come along." In a few minutes they stood in open air, and once more breathed freely. Mounting their horses, they ascended the steep slope of the hill above the cave, and after some trouble reached the summit. Here the first thing that met their gaze was a camp fire, and near to it several men engaged in harnessing their horses to a large waggon or van. The frantic haste with which they performed the operation convinced Ned that he had discovered the cause of the mysterious voices, and that he and Tom had been the innocent cause of frightening the strangers nearly out of their wits. So engrossed were they with their work that our travellers advanced within the circle of light of their fire before they were discovered. The man who first saw them uttered a yell, and the whole party turned round, seized their rifles, and, with terror depicted on their countenances, faced the intruders. "Who comes here?" shouted one. "Friends," answered Ned, laying down his rifle and advancing. Instantly the men threw down their arms and resumed the work of harnessing their horses. "If you be friends," cried the one who spoke first, "give us a hand. I guess all the fiends in the bottomless pit are located just below our feet." "Listen to me for one moment, gentlemen," cried Ned Sinton. "I think I can relieve your minds. What have you heard or seen?" At these words the men stopped and looked inquiringly at their questioner. "Seen? Stranger, we've seed nothin', but we've heerd a sight, we have, I calc'late. We heerd the imps o' darkness talkin' as plain as I hear you. At first I thought it was somebody at the foot of the hill, but all of a suddent the imps took to larfin' as if they'd split just under my feet, so I yelled out to my mate here to come and yoke the beasts, and get away as slick as we could. We was just about ready to slope when you appeared." Ned now explained to them the cause of their alarms, and on search being made, a hole was found, as he had anticipated, close at hand among the bushes, which communicated with the cavern below, and formed a channel for the conveyance of the so called mysterious sounds. "And now," said Ned, "may I ask permission to pass the night with you?" "You're welcome, stranger," replied he who seemed to be the chief of the band, a tall, bearded American named Croft, who seemed more like a bandit than an honest man. His comrades, too, 6 in number, appeared a wild and reckless set of fellows, with whom one would naturally desire to hold as little intercourse as possible. But most men at the Californian diggings had more or less the aspect of brigands, so Ned Sinton and his companion felt little concern as to their characters, although they did feel a little curious as to what had brought them to such a wild region. "If it is not taking too great a liberty," said Ned, after answering the 1,000 questions put to him in rapid succession by his Yankee host, "may I ask what has brought you to this out of the way valley?" "Bear catchin'," answered the man shortly, as he addressed himself to a large venison steak which a comrade had just cooked for him. "Bear catching!" ejaculated Ned. "Ay, and screamin' hard work it is too, I guess, but it pays well." "What do you do with them when caught?" inquired Tom Collins, in a somewhat sceptical tone. "Take 'em down to the cities, and sells 'em to fight with wild bulls." At this answer our travellers stared at the man incredulously. "You're strangers here, I see," he resumed, "else you'd know that we have bull and bear fights. The grizzlies are chained by one leg, and the bulls let loose at 'em. The bulls charge like all possessed, but they find it hard to do much damage to Caleb, whose hide is like a double extra rhinoceros. The grizzlies ginerally get the best of it, and if they was let loose, they'd chaw up the bulls in no time, they would. There's a great demand for 'em just now, and my trade is catchin' 'em alive here in the mountains." The big Yankee stretched out his long limbs and smoked his pipe with the complacent aspect of a man who felt proud of his profession. "Do you mean that you 7 men catch full grown grizzly bears alive, and take them down to the settlements?" inquired Ned in amazement. "Sartainly I do," replied the bear catcher. "And why not, stranger?" "Because I should have thought it impossible." "Nothin's impossible," replied the man quietly. "But how do you manage it?" Instead of replying, the Yankee inquired if the strangers would stay over next forenoon with them. "With much pleasure," answered Ned, not a little amused at the invitation, as well as the man's brusque manner. "Well, then," continued the bear catcher, shaking the ashes out of his pipe and putting it into his hat, "I'll let you see how we do it in the morning. Good night." So saying, he drew his blanket over his head and resigned himself to sleep, an example which was speedily followed by the whole party. CHAPTer 19. Chapter 20 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 20. Grizzly Bear Catching in the Mountains. Ned and Tom dine in the midst of romantic scenery, and hold sagacious converse. The strange devices of woodpeckers. Just as day began to peep on the following morning, the camp was roused by one of the bear catchers, a Mexican, who had been away to visit the bear trap during the night, and now came rushing in among the sleepers, shouting, "Hooroo! Boy, him catch! Big as 20 mans! Fact!" At first Ned thought the camp was attacked by savages, and he and Tom sprang to their feet and grasped their rifles, while they sought to rub their eyes open hastily. A glance at the other members of the camp, however, showed that they were unnecessarily alarmed. Croft leisurely stretched his limbs, and then gathered himself slowly into a sitting posture, while the others arose with various degrees of reluctance. "Been long in?" inquired Croft. "No, jist catched," answered the Mexican, who sat down, lit his pipe, and smoked violently to relieve his impatient feelings. "Big 'un?" inquired Croft again. To this the Mexican answered by rolling his eyes and exclaiming, "Ho!" with a degree of vigour that left his hearers to imagine anything they pleased, and then settle it in their minds that the thing so imagined was out of all sight short of the mark. The excitement of the man at last fully roused the sleepy crew, and Croft sprang up with the agility of a cat. "Ho, boys!" he cried, proceeding to buckle his garments round him. "Up with ye! Ketch the hosses, and put to! Look alive, will ye? Grease your j'ints! Do! Now, strangers, I'll show you how we ketch a bar in this location. Bring your rules, for sometimes he breaks his trap, and isn't there a spree just?" We need scarcely remark that the latter part of this speech was made to Sinton and his comrade, who were drawing the charges of their revolvers and reloading. "Is the trap far off?" inquired Ned. "Quarter of an hour or so. Look sharp, lads." This exhortation was unnecessary, for the men had already caught 3 stout horses, all of which were attached to an enormous waggon or van, whose broad wheels accounted for the tracks discovered in the valley on the previous evening. "That's his cage," said the bear catcher, replying to Ned's look of inquiry. "It's all lined with sheet iron, and would hold an untamed streak o' lightnin', it would. Now then, drive ahead." The lumbering machine jolted slowly down the hill as he spoke, and while several of the party remained with the horses, Croft and our travellers, with the remainder, pushed on ahead. In less than 20 minutes they came to a ravine filled with thick underwood, from the recesses of which came forth sounds of fierce ursine wrath that would have deterred most men from entering. But Croft knew his game was secure, and led the way confidently through the bushes until he reached a spot on which stood what appeared to be a small log cabin, without door or window. Inside of this cabin an enormous grizzly bear raged about furiously, thrusting his snout and claws through the interstices of the logs, and causing splinters to fly all round him, while he growled in tones of the deepest indignation. "Ah! Ain't he a bit o' thunder!" cried Croft, as he walked round the trap, gazing in with glittering eyes at every opening between the logs. "How in the world did you get him in there?" asked Ned Sinton, as soon as his astonishment had abated sufficiently to loosen his tongue. "Easy enough," replied Croft. "If you obsarve the top of the trap, you'll see the rope that suspended it from the limb of that oak. Inside there was a bit of beef, so fixed up that when Mister Caleb laid hold of it, he pulled a sort o' trigger, and down came the trap, shutting him in slick, as you see." At this moment the powerful animal struggled so violently that he tilted his prison on one side, and well nigh overturned it. "Look out, lads!" shouted Croft, darting towards a tree, and cocking his rifle, actions in which he was imitated by all the rest of the party with surprising agility. "Don't fire till it turns over," he cried sternly, on observing that 2 of the more timid members of his band were about to fire at the animal's legs, which appeared below the edge of the trap. Fortunately the bear ceased its efforts just at that critical moment, and the trap fell heavily back to its original position. "By good luck," shouted Croft, "and here comes the cage. Range up on the left, boys, and out with the hosses. They won't stand this." The terrified animals were removed from the scene, trembling violently from head to foot, and the whole band, applying their shoulders to the wheels, slowly pushed the vehicle alongside of the trap until the sides of the two met. There was a strong door in the side of the trap, which was now removed by being pulled inwards, revealing to Bruin an aperture which corresponded to another door opening into the iron-lined cage. There were stout iron bars ready to be shot home the instant he condescended to pass through this entrance, but Caleb, as Croft called him, showed himself sadly destitute of an inquiring disposition. He knew that there was now a hole in his prison wall, for he looked at it. He knew that a hole either conducted into a place or out of it, for lifelong experience had taught him that. Yet he refused to avail himself of the opportunity, and continued to rage round the trap, glaring between the logs at his foes outside. It is unreasonable to suppose that he was afraid to go into the hole because it was a dark one, for he was well accustomed to such dark dens. Besides, no one who looked at him could for a moment suppose that he was, or could be, afraid of anything at all. We must, therefore, put his conduct down to sheer obstinacy. The men poked him with sticks, shouted at him, roared in his face, threw water over him, and even tried the effect of a shot of powder at his flanks, but all to no purpose, although their efforts were continued vigorously for full 2 hours. The bear would not enter that hole on any account whatever. "Try another shot of powder at him," cried Croft, whose patience was now almost exhausted. The shot was fired at his flank, and was received with a ferocious growl, while the strong woodwork of the trap trembled under his efforts to escape. "Ain't it vexin'?" said Croft, sitting down on the stump of a tree, and wiping the perspiration from his forehead. Ned Sinton and Tom, who had done their utmost to assist their new acquaintance, sat down beside him, and admitted that it was vexing. As if by one impulse, the whole party then sat down to rest, and at that moment, having, as it were, valiantly asserted his right of independent action, the bear turned slowly round, and quietly scrambled through the hole. The men sprang up, the massive iron bars were shot into their sockets with a clang, and Bruin was a prisoner for life. As neither Edward Sinton nor Tom Collins had any particular desire to become bear catchers, they bade their new friends adieu that afternoon, and continued their journey. The road, as they advanced, became more and more steep and rugged, so that they could only proceed at a walk, and in many places experienced considerable difficulty, and ran no little risk in passing along the faces of cliffs, where the precipices ascended hundreds of feet upwards like walls on the one hand, and descended sheer down into an unfathomable abyss on the other. But the exceeding grandeur of the scenery amply repaid their toils, and the deep roar of that mighty cataract ever sounded in their ears. At length they reached the head of the valley, and stood under the spray of the fall, which, expanding far above and around the seething cauldron whence it sprang, drenched the surrounding country with perpetual showers. Here a gap or pass in the mountains was discovered, ascending on the left, and affording apparently an exit from the valley. Up this the travellers toiled until they cleared the spray of the falls, and then sat down beside a clump of trees to dry their garments in the sunshine, and to cook their midday meal. "What a glorious thing it is, Tom, to wander thus unrestrained amid such scenes," said Ned Sinton, as he busied himself roasting a piece of venison, which his rifle had procured but half an hour before. "How infinitely more delightful than travelling in the civilised world, where one is cheated at every turn, and watched and guarded as if robbery or murder or high treason were the only probable objects a traveller could have in view." "Comparisons, my dear fellow. You know the proverb," replied Tom Collins. "Don't uphold California at the expense of the continent. Besides, there are many in this world who would rather 1,000 times wander by the classic Lake of Como, with its theatrical villas and its enchanting sunshine and perfume, or paddle up the castellated Rhine, than scramble here among wild rocks and woods and cataracts, with the chance of meeting an occasional savage, or a grizzly bear." "Go on, my boy," said Ned, with a touch of sarcasm in his tone. "You haven't read me half a lesson yet. Besides the many you refer to, are there not hundreds, ay, thousands, whose chief enjoyment in travelling is derived from the historical associations called up by the sight of the ruined castles and temples of classic ground, whose delight it is to think that here Napoleon crossed the Alps, as Hannibal did before him, and many a nobody has done after him, that there, within these mouldering ruins, the oracles of old gave forth their voice, forgetting perhaps too easily, while they indulge in these reminiscences of the past, that the warrior's end was wholesale murder, and that the oracles spoke only to deceive poor ignorant human nature. Ha! I would not give one hearty dash into pure uncontaminated nature for all the famous tours put together." Ned looked round him as he spoke with a glow of enthusiasm that neither badinage nor philosophy could check. "Just look around thee," he continued. "Open thine ears, Tom, to the music of yon cataract, and expand thy nostrils to the wild perfume of these pines." "I wouldn't at this moment," quietly remarked Tom, "exchange for it the perfume of that venison steak, of which I pray thee to be more regardful, else thou'lt upset it into the fire." "Oh, Tom, incorrigible." "Not at all, Ned. While you flatter yourself that you have all the enthusiastic study of nature to yourself, here have I succeeded within the last few minutes in solving a problem in natural history which has puzzled my brains for weeks past. And pray thee, what may that be, most sapient philosopher? Do you see yonder bird clinging to the stem of that tree, and pitching into it as if it were its most deadly foe? I do. A woodpecker it is. Well," continued Tom, sitting down before his portion of the venison steak, "that bird has cleared up 2 points in natural history which have, up till this time, been a mystery to me. The one was, why woodpeckers should spend their time in pecking the trees so incessantly; the other was, how it happened that several trees I have cut down could have had so many little holes bored in their trunks, and an acorn neatly inserted into each. Now that little bird has settled the question for me. I caught him in the act not 10 minutes ago. He flew to that tree with an acorn in his beak, tried to insert it into a hole which didn't fit, being too small, so he tried another which did fit, poked the nut in, small end first, and tapped it scientifically home. Now, why did he do it? That's the question." "Because he wanted to, probably," remarked Ned, "and very likely he lays up a store of food for winter in this manner." "Very possibly. I shall make a note of this, for I'm determined to have it sifted to the bottom. Meanwhile, I'll trouble you for another junk of venison." It was many weeks afterwards ere Tom Collins succeeded in sifting this interesting point to the bottom, but perhaps the reader may not object to have the result of his inquiries noted at this point in our story. Many of the trees in California, on being stripped of their bark, are found to be perforated all over with holes about the size of a musket ball. These are pierced by the woodpecker with such precision and regularity that one might believe they had been cut out by a ship carpenter. The summer is spent by this busy little bird in making these holes, and in filling them with acorns. One acorn goes to one hole, and the bird will not try to force the nut into a hole that is too small for it, but flutters round the tree until it finds one which fits it exactly. Thus, one by one, the holes are filled, and a store of food is laid up for winter use in a larder which secures it from the elements, and places it within reach of the depositor when the winter snows have buried all the acorns that lie upon the ground, and put them beyond the reach of woodpeckers. The birds never encroach on their store until the snow has covered the ground, then they begin to draw upon their bank; and it is a curious fact that the bills of these birds are always honoured, for their instinct enables them to detect the bad nuts with unerring certainty, so that their bank is always filled with good ones. This matter of selecting the good nuts is a mere chance with men, for often those shells which seem the soundest are found to contain a grub instead of a nut. Even the sagacious Indian is an uncertain judge in this respect, but the woodpecker, provided by an all-wise Creator with an unerring instinct, never makes a mistake in selecting its store of food for winter. Chapter 20. Chapter 21 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 21. Curious Trees and Still More Curious Plains. An Interesting Discovery followed by a Sad One. Fate of Travellers in the Mountains. A Sudden Illness. Ned proves himself to be a friend in need and in deed, as well as an excellent doctor, hunter, cook, and nurse. Deer shooting by firelight. During the course of their wanderings among the mountains, our hero and his companion met with many strange adventures, and saw many strange sights, which, however, we cannot afford space to dwell upon here. Their knowledge in natural history, too, was wonderfully increased, for they were both observant men, and a school of nature is the best in which any one can study. Audubon, the hunter-naturalist of America, knew this well, and few men have added so much as he to the sum of human knowledge in his peculiar department, while fewer still have so wonderfully enriched the pages of romantic adventure in wild, unknown regions. In these wanderings, too, Ned and Tom learned to know experimentally that truth is indeed stranger than fiction, and that if the writers of fairy tales had travelled more, they would have saved their imaginations a deal of trouble, and produced more extraordinary works. The size of the trees they encountered was almost beyond belief, though none of them surpassed the giant of which an account has been already given. Among other curious trees they found sugar pines growing in abundance in one part of the country. This is, perhaps, the most graceful of all the pines. With a perfectly straight and cylindrical stem and smooth bark, it rears its proud crest high above other trees, and flings its giant limbs abroad like a sentinel guarding the forest. The stem rises to about 4/5 of its height, perfectly free of branches. Above this point the branches spread out almost horizontally, drooping a little bit at the ends from the weight of the huge cones which they bear. These cones are about 1.5 feet long, and under each leaf lies a seed the size of a pea, which has an agreeably sweet taste, and is much esteemed by the Indians, who use it as an article of food. Another remarkable sight they saw was a plain of some miles in extent, completely covered with shattered pieces of quartz, which shone with specks and veins of pure gold. Of course they had neither time nor inclination to attempt the laborious task of pulverizing this quartz in order to obtain the precious metal, but Ned moralised a little as they galloped over the plain, spurning the gold beneath their horses' hoofs as if it had been of no value whatever. They both puzzled themselves also to account for so strange an appearance, but the only solution that seemed to them at all admissible was, that a quartz vein had, at some early period of the world's history, been shattered by a volcanic eruption, and the plain thus strewn with gold. But from the contemplation of these and many other interesting sights and phenomena, we must pass to an event which seriously affected the future plans of the travellers. One beautiful evening, such an evening as, from its deep quiet and unusual softness, leaves a lasting impression on the memory, the two horsemen found themselves slowly toiling up the steep acclivity of a mountain ridge. Their advance was toilsome, for the way was rugged, and no track of any kind assisted them in their ascent. "I fear the poor horses will give in," said Ned, dismounting and looking back at his companion, who slowly followed him. "We are near the summit," answered Tom, "and they shall have a long rest there." As he spoke, they both dismounted and advanced on foot, leading their fatigued horses by the bridles. "Do you know," said Tom, with a sigh, "I feel more used up to day than I have been since we started on this journey. I think we had better encamp and have a cup of tea. There is a little left yet, if I mistake not." "With all my heart, Tom. I too feel inclined to rest, and " Ned paused, for at that moment they overtopped the highest edge of the ridge, and the view that burst upon them was well fitted to put to flight every previous train of thought. The ridge on which they stood rose several hundred feet above the level of the plain beyond, and commanded a view of unknown extent towards the far west. The richest possible sweep of country was spread out at their feet like a huge map, bathed in a glow of yellow sunshine. Lakes and streams, crags and rocks, sward and swamp and plain, undulating and abrupt, barren and verdant, all were there, and could be embraced in a single wide sweeping glance. It seemed to the entranced travellers like the very Garden of Eden. Waterfowl flew about in all directions, the whistling of their wings and their wild cries being mellowed by distance into pleasant music, and far away on the right, where a clear lake mirrored each tree on its banks, as if the image were reality, a herd of deer were seen cooling their sides and limbs in the water, while on the extreme horizon a line of light indicated the shores of the vast Pacific Ocean. Ere the travellers could find words to express their feelings, a rock with a piece of stick and a small rag attached to it attracted their attention. "We are not the first to have set their feet here, it seems," said Ned, pointing to the signal. "Strange," muttered Tom Collins, as they turned towards the rock. "That does not look like an Indian mark. Yet I would have thought that white men had never stood here before, for the spot is far removed from any known diggings, and, as we know fair well, is not easily reached." On gaining the rock, they found that the rag was a shred of linen, without mark of any kind to tell who had placed it there. "It must have been the freak of some Indian hunter," said Ned, examining the rock on which the little flagstaff was raised. "Say, no, here are some marks cut in the stone. Look here, Tom, can you decipher this? It looks like the letter G. D.B." "D.B.!" cried Tom Collins, with a degree of energy that surprised his friend. "Let me see." Tom carefully removed the moss, and cleared out the letters, which were unmistakable. "Who can D.B. have been?" said Ned. Tom looked up with a flushed countenance and a glittering eye, as he exclaimed, "Who? Who but Daniel Boone, Cooper's great hero, Hawkeye of the last of the Mohicans, Deerslayer, Leather Stocking. He has been here before us. Ay, brave spirit, long before other hunters had dared to venture far into the territory of the scalping, torturing, yelling Redskin, this bold heart had pushed westward, fearless and alone, until his eagle eye rested on the great Pacific. It must have been he. I have followed him, Ned, in spirit, throughout all his wild career, for I know him to be a real man and no fiction; but little did I think that I should see a spot where his manly foot had rested, or live to discover his farthest step in the far west." Ned Sinton listened with interest to the words of his friend, but he did not interrupt him, for he respected the deep emotions that swelled his heart and beamed from his flashing eye. "We spoke, Ned, some time ago, of historical associations," continued Tom. "Here are historical associations worth coming all this way to call up. Here are associations that touch my heart more than all the deeds of ancient chivalry. Ah! Daniel Boone, little didst thou think, when thy hawk's eye rested here, that in a few short years the land would be overrun by gold diggers from all ends of the earth." "But this flag," said Ned, "he could never have placed that here. It would have been swept away by storms years ago." "You're right," said Tom, turning over the stones that supported the staff. "Halloo! what have we here?" He pulled out a roll of oiled cloth as he spoke, and, on opening it, discovered a scrap of paper on which were written in pencil the words, "Help us, for God's sake help us. We are perishing at the foot of the hill to the southward of this." No name or date was attached to this strange paper, but the purport of it was sufficiently clear, so, without wasting time in fruitless conjecture, the young men immediately sprang on their horses and rode down the hill in the direction indicated. The route proved more rugged and steep than that by which they had ascended, and for a considerable distance they wound their way between the trunks of a closely planted cypress grove, after passing which they emerged upon a rocky plain of small extent, at the further extremity of which a green oasis indicated the presence of a spring. Towards this they rode in silence. "Ah!" exclaimed Ned, in a tone of deep pity, as he reined up at the foot of an oak tree, "too late." They were indeed too late to succour the poor creatures who had placed the scrap of paper on the summit of that mountain ridge, in the faint hope that friendly hands might discover it in time. 6 dead forms lay at the foot of the oak, side by side, with their pale faces turned upwards, and the expression of extreme suffering still lingering on their shrunken features. It needed no living witness to tell their sad history. The skeletons of oxen, the broken cart, the scattered mining tools, and the empty provision casks showed clearly enough that they were emigrants who had left their homesteads in the States and tried to reach the gold regions of California by the terrible overland journey. They had lost their way among the dreary fastnesses of the mountains, travelled far from the right road to the mines, and perished at last of exhaustion and hunger on the very borders of the golden land. The grey-haired father of the family lay beside a young girl with his arm clasped round her neck. 2 younger men also lay near them, one lying as if, in dying, he had sought to afford support to the other. The bodies were still fresh, and a glance showed that nearly all of them were of one family. "Alas, Ned, had we arrived a few days sooner, we might have saved them," said Tom. "I think they must have been freed from their pains and sorrows here more than a week since," replied the other, fastening his horse to a tree, and proceeding to search the clothes of the unfortunates for letters or anything that might afford a clue to their identity. "We must stay here an hour or 2, Tom, and bury them." No scrap of writing, however, was found, not even a book with a name on it to tell who the strangers were. With hundreds of others, no doubt, they had left their homes, full of life and hope, to seek their fortunes in the land of gold, but the Director of man's steps had ordered it otherwise, and their golden dreams had ended with their lives in the unknown wilderness. The 2 friends covered the bodies with sand and stones, and, leaving them in their shallow grave, pursued their way. But they had not gone far when a few large drops of rain fell, and the sky became overcast with dark leaden clouds. "Ned," said Tom anxiously, "I fear we shall be caught by the rainy season. It's awkward being so far from the settlements at such a time." "Oh, nonsense! Surely you don't mind a wetting?" cried Ned. "We can push on in spite of rain." "Can we?" retorted Tom, with unwonted gravity. "It's clear that you've never seen the rainy season, else you would not speak of it so lightly. Why, man, you seem to have lost pluck all of a sudden. Come, cheer up. Rain or no rain, I mean to have a good supper and a good night's rest, and here is just the spot that will suit us." Ned Sinton leaped off his horse as he spoke, and, fastening him to a tree, loosened the saddle girths, and set about preparing the encampment. Tom Collins assisted him. But neither the rallying of his comrade nor his own efforts could enable the latter to shake off the depression of spirits with which he was overpowered. That night the rain came down in torrents, and drenched the travellers to the skin, despite their most ingenious contrivances to keep it out. They spent the night in misery, and when morning broke, Ned found that his companion was smitten down with ague. Even Ned's buoyant spirits were swamped for a time at this unlooked-for catastrophe, for the dangers of their position were not slight. It was clear that Tom would not be able to travel for many days, for his whole frame trembled when the fits came on, with a violence that seemed to threaten dislocation to all his joints. Ned felt that both their lives, under God, depended on his keeping well, and being able to procure food for and nurse his friend. At the same time he knew that the rainy season, if indeed it had not already begun, would soon set in, and perhaps render the country impassable. There was no use, however, in giving way to morbid fears, so Ned faced his difficulties manfully, and, remembering the promise which he had given his old uncle at parting from him in England, he began by offering up a short but earnest prayer at the sight of his friend's couch. "Ned," said Tom sadly, as his companion ceased, "I fear that you'll have to return alone." "Come, come, don't speak that way, Tom. It isn't right. God is able to help us here as well as in cities. I don't think you are so ill as you fancy. The sight of these poor emigrants has depressed you. Cheer up, my boy, and I'll let you see that you were right when you said I could turn my hand to anything. I'll be hunter, woodcutter, cook, and nurse all at once, and see if I don't make you all right in a day or 2. You merely want rest, so keep quiet for a little, till I make a sort of sheltered place to put you in." The sun broke through the clouds as he spoke, and shed a warm beam down on poor Tom, who was more revived by the sight of the cheering orb of day than by the words of his companion. In half an hour Tom was wrapped in the driest portion of the driest blanket, his wet habiliments were hung up before a roaring fire to dry, and a rude bower of willows covered with turf was erected over his head to guard him from another attack of rain should it come. But it didn't come. The sun shone cheerily all day, and Ned's preparations were completed before the next deluge came, so that when it descended on the following morning, comparatively little found its way to Tom's resting place. It was scarcely a resting place, however. Tom turned and groaned on his uneasy couch, and proved to be an uncommonly restive patient. He complained particularly when Ned left him for a few hours each day to procure fresh provisions. But he smiled, and confessed himself unreasonable when Ned returned, as he always did, with a dozen wild ducks, or several geese or hares attached to his belt, or a fat deer on his shoulders. Game of all kinds was plentiful, the weather improved, the young hunter's rifle was good, and his aim was true, so that, but for the sickness of his friend, he would have considered the life he led a remarkably pleasant one. As day after day passed by, however, and Tom Collins grew no better, but rather worse, he began to be seriously alarmed about him. Tom himself took the gloomiest view of his case, and at last said plainly he believed he was dying. At first Ned sought to effect a cure by the simple force of kind treatment and care, but finding that this would not do, he bethought him of trying some experiments in a medicinal way. He chanced to have a box of pills with him, and tried one, although with much hesitation and fear, for he had got them from a miner who could not tell what they were composed of, but who assured him that they were a sovereign remedy for the blues. Ned, it must be confessed, was rather a reckless doctor. He was anxious, at the time he procured the pills, to relieve a poor miner who seemed to be knocked up with hard work, but who insisted that he had a complication of ailments. So Ned bought the pills for 20 times their value, and gave a few to the man, advising him at the same time to rest and feed well, which he did, and the result was a complete cure. Our hero did not feel so certain, however, that they would succeed as well in the present case, but he resolved to try their virtues, for Tom was so prostrate that he could scarcely be induced to whisper a word. When the cold fit seized him, he trembled so violently that his teeth rattled in his head, and when that passed off, it was followed by a burning fever, which was even worse to bear. At first he was restive, and inclined to be peevish under his illness, the result, no doubt, of a naturally robust constitution, struggling unsuccessfully against the attacks of disease; but when he was completely overcome, his irascibility passed away, and he became patient, sweet-tempered, and gentle as a child. "Come, Tom, my boy," said Ned one evening, advancing to the side of his companion's couch, and sitting down beside him, while he held up the pill. "Open your mouth and shut your eyes, as we used to say at school." "What is it?" asked the sick man faintly. "Never you mind. Patients have no business to know what their doctors prescribe. It's intended to cure ague, and that's enough for you to know. If it doesn't cure you, it's not my fault anyhow. Open your mouth, sir." Tom smiled sadly, and obeyed. The pill was dropped in, a spoonful of water added to float it down, and it disappeared. But the pill had no effect whatever. Another was tried with like result, or rather with like absence of all result, and at last the box was finished without the sick man being a whit the better or the worse for them. This was disheartening, but Ned, having begun to dabble in medicines, felt an irresistible tendency to go on. Like the tiger who has once tasted blood, he could not now restrain himself. "I think you are a little better to night, Tom," he said, on the third evening after the administration of the first pill. "I'm making you a decoction of bark here that will certainly do you good." Tom shook his head, but said nothing. He evidently felt that a negative sign was an appropriate reply to the notion of his being better, or of any decoction whatever doing him good. However, Ned stirred the panful of bark and water vigorously, chatting all the while in a cheering tone, in order to keep up his friend's spirits, while the blaze of the camp fire lit up his handsome face, and bathed his broad chest and shoulders with a ruddy glow that rendered still more pallid the lustre of the pale stars overhead. "It's lucky the rain has kept off so long," he said, without looking up from the mysterious decoction over which he bent with the earnest gaze of an alchemist. "I do believe that has something to do with your being better, my boy. Either that or the pills, or both." Ned totally ignored the fact that his friend did not admit that he was better. "And this stuff," he continued, "will set you up in a day or two. It's as good as quinine any day, and you've no notion what wonderful cures that medicine effects. It took me a long time, too, to find the right tree. I wandered over 2 or 3 leagues of country before I came upon one. Luckily it was a fine sunny day, and I enjoyed it much. I wish you had been with me, Tom. But you'll be all right soon. I lay down, too, once or twice in the sunshine, and put my head in the long grass, and tried to fancy myself in a miniature forest. Did you ever try that, Tom?" Ned looked round as he spoke, but the sick man gave a languid smile and shut his eyes, so he resumed his stirring of the pot and his rambling talk. "You've no idea, if you never tried it, how one can deceive oneself in that way. I often did it at home, when I was a little boy. I used to go away with a companion into a grass field, and, selecting a spot where the grass was long and tangled, and mixed with various kinds of weeds, we used to lie flat down with our faces as near to the ground as possible, and gaze through the grass stems until we fancied the blades were trees, and the pebbles were large rocks, and the clods were mountains. Sometimes a huge beetle would crawl past, and we instantly thought of St. George and the Dragon, and as the unwieldy monster came stumbling on through the forest, we actually became quite excited, and could scarcely believe that what we tried to imagine was not real." "We seldom spoke on these occasions, my companion and I," continued Ned, suspending the stirring of the decoction and filling his pipe, as he sat down close to the blazing logs. "Speaking, we found, always broke the spell, so we agreed to keep perfect silence for as long a time as possible. You must try it, Tom, some day, for although it may seem to you a childish thing to do, there are many childish things which, when done in a philosophical spirit, are deeply interesting and profitable to men." Ned ceased talking for a few minutes while he ignited his pipe. When he spoke again, his thoughts had wandered into a new channel. "I'm sorry we have no fresh meat to day," he said, looking earnestly at his friend. "The remainder of that hare is not very savoury, but we must be content. I walked all the country round to day without getting within range of any living thing. There were plenty both of deer and birds, but they were so wild I could not get near them. It would matter little if you were well, Tom, but you require good food just now, my poor fellow. Do you feel better to night?" Tom groaned, and said that he felt easier, in a very uneasy voice, after which they both relapsed into silence, and no sound was heard save the crackling of the logs, and the bubbling of the mysterious decoction in the pot. Suddenly Tom uttered a slight hiss, that peculiar sound so familiar to backwoods ears, by which hunters indicate to each other that something unusual has been observed, and that they had better be on the alert. Ned Sinton's nerves were of that firm kind which can never be startled or taken by surprise. He did not spring to his feet, but, quick as thought, he stretched forth his long arm, and, seizing his rifle, cocked it, while he glanced at his friend's eye to see in what direction he was looking. Tom pointed eagerly with his thin hand straight across the fire. Ned turned in that direction, and at once saw the objects which had attracted his attention. 2 bright gleaming balls shone in the dark background of the forest, like 2 lustrous Irish diamonds in a black field of bog oak. He knew at once that they were the eyes of a deer, which, with a curiosity well known as peculiar to many wild animals, had approached the fire to stare at it. Ned instantly threw forward his rifle. The light of the fire enabled him easily to align the sights on the glittering eyes. The deadly contents belched forth, and a heavy crash told that his aim had been true. "Bravo!" shouted Tom Collins, forgetting his ailments in the excitement of the moment, while Ned threw down his rifle, drew his hunting knife, sprang over the fire, and disappeared in the surrounding gloom. In a few minutes he returned with a fine deer on his shoulders. "So ho, my boy," he cried, flinging the carcass down. "That was a lucky shot. We shall sup well to night, thanks to curiosity, which is a most useful quality in beast as well as man. But what's wrong? You look pale and You don't mean to say you're laughing?" Tom was indeed pale, for the sudden excitement, in his exhausted condition, had been too much for him, yet there did seem a peculiar expression about the corners of his mouth that might have been the remains of a laugh. "Ned," he said faintly, "the decoction's all gone." Ned sprang up and ran to the fire, where, sure enough, he found the pan, over which he had bent so long with necromantic gaze, upset, and most of the precious liquid gone. "Ha!" he cried, catching up the pot, "not all gone, lad, so your rejoicing was premature. There's quite enough left yet to physic you well, and it's in a fit state to be taken, so open your mouth at once, and be a good boy." A little of the medicine, mixed in water, was administered, and Tom, making a wry face, fell back on his couch with a sigh. Immediately after, he was seized with, perhaps, the severest shaking fit he had yet experienced, so that Ned could not help recalling the well-known caution, so frequently met with on medicine vials, "When taken, to be well shaken," despite the anxiety he felt for his friend. But soon after, the trembling fit passed away, and Tom sank into a quiet slumber, the first real rest he had enjoyed for several days. Ned felt his pulse and his brow, looked long and earnestly into his face, nodded approvingly once or twice, and, having tucked the blankets gently in round the sick man, he proceeded to prepare supper. He removed just enough of the deer's skin to permit of a choice morsel being cut out. This he put into the pot, and made thereof a rich and savoury soup, which he tasted, and, if smacking one's lips and tasting it again twice indicated anything, the soup was good. But Ned Sinton did not eat it. That was Tom's supper, and was put just near enough the fire to keep it warm. This being done, Ned cut out another choice morsel of deer's meat, which he roasted and ate, as only those can eat who are well, and young, and robust, and in the heart of the wilderness. Then he filled his pipe, sat down close to Tom's couch, placed his back against a tree, crossed his arms on his breast, and smoked and watched the whole night long. He rose gently several times during the night, however, partly for the purpose of battling off his tendency to sleep, and partly for the purpose of replenishing the fire and keeping the soup warm. But Tom Collins took no supper that night. Ned longed very much to see him awake, but he didn't. Towards morning, Ned managed for some time to fight against sleep by entering into a close and philosophical speculation as to what was the precise hour at which that pot of soup could not properly be called supper, but would merge into breakfast. This question still remained unsettled in his mind when grey dawn lit up the peaks of the eastern hills, and he was still debating it, and nodding like a Chinese mandarin, and staring at intervals like a confused owl, when the sun shot over the tree tops, and, alighting softly on the sleeper's face, aroused him. Tom awoke refreshed, ate his breakfast with relish, took his medicine without grumbling, smiled on his comrade, and squeezed his hand as he went to sleep again, with a heavy sigh of comfort. From that hour he mended rapidly, and in a week after he was well enough to resume his journey. Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 22. Powerful effects of gold on the aspect of things in general. The doings at Little Creek diggings. Larry becomes speculative, and digs a hole which nearly proves the grave of many miners. Captain Bunting takes a fearful dive. Ah wow is smitten to the earth. A mysterious letter, and a splendid dish. We must now beg our reader to turn with us to another scene. The appearance of Little Creek diggings altered considerably, and for the worse, after Ned Sinton and Tom Collins left. A rush of miners had taken place in consequence of the reports of the successful adventurers who returned to Sacramento for supplies, and, in the course of a few weeks, the whole valley was swarming with eager gold hunters. The consequence of this was that laws of a somewhat stringent nature had to be made. The ground was measured off into lots of about 10 feet square, and apportioned to the miners. Of course, in so large and rough a community, there was a good deal of crime, so that Judge Lynch's services were frequently called in. But upon the whole, considering the circumstances of the colony, there was much less than might have been expected. At the time of which we write, namely, several weeks after the events narrated in our last chapter, the whole colony was thrown into a state of excitement in consequence of large quantities of gold having been discovered on the banks of the stream, in the ground on which the log huts and tents were erected. The result of this discovery was that the whole place was speedily riddled with pits and their concomitant mud heaps, and to walk about after nightfall was a difficult as well as a dangerous amusement. Many of the miners pulled down their tents and began to work upon the spots on which they previously stood. Others began to dig all round their wooden huts, until these rude domiciles threatened to become insular, and a few pulled their dwellings down in order to get at the gold beneath them. One man, as he sat on his doorstep smoking his pipe after dinner, amused himself by poking the handle of an axe into the ground, and unexpectedly turned up a small nugget of gold worth several dollars. In 10 minutes there was a pit before his door, big enough to hold a sheep, and before night he realised about $50. Another, in the course of 2 days, dug out $100 behind his tent, and all were more or less fortunate. At this particular time it happened that Captain Bunting had been seized with one of his irresistible and romantic wandering fits, and had gone off with the blunderbuss to hunt in the mountains. Maxton, having heard of better diggings elsewhere, and not caring for the society of our adventurers when Ned and Tom were absent, had bid them good bye, and gone off with his pick and shovel on his shoulder, and his prospecting pan in his hand, no one knew whither. Bill Jones was down at Sacramento purchasing provisions, as the prices at the diggings were ruinous, and Ko Sing had removed with one of the other Chinamen to another part of the creek. Thus it came to pass that Larry O'Neil and Ah wow, the Chinaman, were left alone to work out the claims of the party. One fine day Larry and his comrade were seated in the sunshine, concluding their midday meal, when a Yankee passed and told them of the discoveries that had been made further down the settlement. "Good luck to you," said Larry, nodding facetiously to the man, as he put a tin mug to his lips and drained its contents to the bottom. "Ha! It's the poteen I'm fond of. Not but that I've seen better. Faix, I've seldom tasted worse. But there's a virtue in gold digging that would make Accafortis go down like milk, it would. Will you try a drop?" Larry filled the pannikin as he spoke, and handed it to the Yankee, who, nothing loath, drained it, and returned it empty, with thanks. "They're digging gold out of the cabin floors, are they?" said Larry, wiping his mouth with the sleeve of his shirt. "They air," answered the man. "One feller dug up $300 yesterday, from the very spot where he's been snoring on the last 6 months." "Ah, then that's a party little sum," said Larry, with a leer that showed he didn't believe a word of it. "Does he expect more to-morrow, think you?" "Don't know," said the man, half offended at the doubt thus cast on his veracity. "You better go and ax him. Good day, stranger," and the Yankee strode away rapidly. Larry scratched his head. Then he rubbed his nose, and then his chin, without apparently deriving any particular benefit from these actions. After that he looked up at Ah wow, who was seated cross-legged on the ground opposite to him, smoking, and asked him what was his opinion. "Dunno," said the Chinaman, without moving a muscle of his stolid countenance. "Oh, you're an entertainin' craytur, you are. I'll just make a hole here where I sit, and see what comes of it. Sure, it's better nor doing nothin'." Saying this, Larry refilled his empty pipe, stretched himself at full length on his side, rested his head on his left hand, and smoked complacently for 3 minutes; after which he took up the long sheath knife, with which he had just cut up his supper, and began carelessly to turn over the sod. "Sure, there is gold," he said, on observing several specks of the shining metal. As he dug deeper down, he struck upon a hard substance, which, on being turned up, proved to be a piece of quartz the size of a hen's egg, in which rich lumps and veins of gold were embedded. "Me eye niver!" shouted the Irishman, starting up and throwing away his pipe in his excitement. "If it isn't a nugget! Hooray! Where's the pick?" Larry overturned the Chinaman, who sat in his way, darted into the tent for his pick and shovel, and in 5 minutes was a foot down into the earth. He came upon a solid rock, however, much to his chagrin, a few inches further down. "Faix, I'll tell you what I'll do," he said, as a new idea struck him. "I'll dig inside of the tent. It'll keep the sun and the rain off." This remark was made half to himself and half to Ah wow, who, having gathered himself up and resumed his pipe, was regarding him with as much interest as he ever regarded anything. As Ah wow made no objection, and did not appear inclined to volunteer an opinion, Larry entered the tent, cleared all the things away into one corner, and began to dig in the centre of it. It was fortunate that he adopted this plan. First, because the rainy season having now set in, the tent afforded him shelter, and secondly, because the soil under the tent turned out to be exceedingly rich. So much so that in the course of the next few days he and the Chinaman dug out upwards of $1,000. But the rains, which for some time past had given indubitable hints that they meant to pay a long visit to the settlement, at last came down like a waterspout, and flooded Larry and his comrade out of the hole. They cut a deep trench round the tent, however, to carry off the water, and continued their profitable labour unremittingly. The inside of the once comfortable tent now presented a very remarkable appearance. All the property of the party was thrust into the smallest possible corner, and Larry's bed was spread out above it. The remainder of the space was a yawning hole 6 feet deep, and a mound of earth about 4 feet high. This earth formed a sort of breastwork, over which Larry had to clamber night and morning in leaving and returning to his couch. The Chinaman slept in his own little tent hard by. There was another inconvenience attending this style of mining which Larry had not foreseen when he adopted it, and which caused the tent of our adventurers to become a sort of public nuisance. Larry had frequently to go down to the stream for provisions, and Ah wow, being given to sleep when no one watched him, took advantage of these opportunities to retire to his own tent. The consequence was that strangers who chanced to look in passing, frequently fell headlong into the hole ere they were aware of its existence, and on more than one occasion Larry returned and found a miner in the bottom of it with his neck well nigh broken. To guard against this, he hit upon the plan of putting up a cautionary ticket. He purchased a flat board and a pot of black paint, with which he wrote the words, "Mind your feet, there's a big hole," and fixed it up over the entrance. The device answered very well in as far as those who could read were concerned, but as there were many who could not read at all, and who mistook the ticket for the sign of a shop or store, the accidents became rather more frequent than before. The Irishman at last grew desperate, and taking Ah wow by the pigtail, vowed that if he deserted his post again, he'd blow out all the brains he had, if he had any at all, and if that wouldn't do, he'd cut 'em up into mincemeat, so he would. The Chinaman evidently thought him in earnest, for he fell on his knees and promised, with tears in his eyes, that he would never do it again, or words to that effect. One day Larry and Ah wow were down in the hole labouring for gold as if it were life. It was a terribly rainy day, so bad that it was almost impossible to keep the water out. Larry had clambered out of the hole, and was seated on the top of the mud heap, resting himself and gazing down upon his companion, who slowly, but with the steady regularity of machinery, dug out the clay, and threw it on the heap, when a voice called from without. "Is this Mr. Edward Sinton's tent?" "It is that same," cried Larry, rising. "Don't come in, or it'll be worse for you." "Here's a letter for him, then, and $20 to pay." "Musha! But it's chape postage," said Larry, lifting the curtain and stepping out. "Couldn't you say 30 now?" "Come, down with the cash, and none of your jaw," said the man, who was a surly fellow, and did not seem disposed to stand joking. "Oh, be all manes, yer honour," retorted Larry, with mock servility, as he counted out the money. "Av it wouldn't displaise your lordship, may I take the presumption to ax how the sail came to be broken?" "I know nothing about it," answered the man, as he pocketed the money. "I found it on the road between this and Sacramento, and as I was passing this way anyhow, I brought it on." "Ah, then, it was a great kindness entirely, to go so far out of your way, and that for a stranger too, and for nothing, or next thing to it," said Larry, looking after the man as he walked away. "Well, now," he continued, re-entering the tent, and seating himself again on the top of the mud heap, while he held the letter in his hand at arm's length, "this bates all, and what am I to do with it? Sure, it's not right to break the seal of another man's letter, but then it's broke already, and there can be no sin in reading it. Maybe," he continued, with a look of anxiety, "the poor lad's ill, or dead, and he's wrote to say so. Sure, I would like to read it, if I only knowed how, but me edication's been forgot, bad luck to the schoolmasters. I can only make out big print, one letter at a time." The poor man looked wistfully at the letter, feeling that it might possibly contain information of importance to all of them, and that delay in taking action might cause irreparable misfortune. While he meditated what had best be done, and scanned the letter in all directions, a footstep was heard outside, and the hearty voice of Captain Bunting shouted, "Ship ahoy! Who's within, boys?" "Hurroo, captain!" shouted Larry, jumping up with delight. "Mind your foot, captain, dear, don't come in." "Why not?" inquired the captain, as he lifted the curtain. "Sure, it's no use tellin' you now," said Larry, as Captain Bunting fell head foremost into Ah wow's arms, and drove that worthy creature, as he himself would have said, stern foremost, into the mud and water at the bottom. The captain happened to have a haunch of venison on his shoulder, and the blunderbuss under his arm, so that the crash and the splash, as they all floundered in the mud, were too much for Larry, who sat down again on the mud heap and roared with laughter. It is needless to go further into the details of this misadventure. Captain Bunting and the Chinaman were soon restored to the upper world, happily unhurt. So, having changed their garments, they went into Ah wow's tent to discuss the letter. "Let me see it, Larry," said the captain, sitting down on an empty port cask. Larry handed him the missive, and he read as follows: "San Francisco, Edward Sinton, Esquire, Little Creek Diggings. My dear sir, I have just time before the post closes to say that I only learned a few days ago that you were at Little Creek, otherwise I should have written sooner to say that." Here the captain seemed puzzled. "Now, ain't that aggravatin'?" he said. "The seal has torn away the most important bit of the letter. I wish I had the villains by the nose that opened it. Look here, Larry, can you guess what it was?" Larry took the letter, and, after scrutinising it with intense gravity and earnestness, returned it with the remark that it was "beyont him entirely." "That," said the captain, again attempting to read, "that something great success. So you and Captain Bunting had better come down at once. Believe me, my dear sir, yours faithfully, John Thompson." "Now," remarked the captain, with a look of chagrin, as he laid down the letter, folded his hands together, and gazed into Larry's grave visage, "nothin' half so tantalisin' as that has happened to me since the time when my good ship, the Roving Bess, was cast ashore at San Francisco." "It's provokin'," replied Larry, "and perplexin'." "It's most unfortunate, too," continued the captain, knitting up his visage, "that Sinton should be away just at this time, without rudder, chart, or compass, and bound for no port that any one knows of. Why, the fellow may be deep in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, for all I can tell. I might start off at once without him, but maybe that would be of no use. What can it be that old Thompson's so anxious about? Why didn't the old figurehead use his pen more freely? His tongue goes fast enough to drive the engines of a 74. What is to be done?" Although Captain Bunting asked the question with thorough earnestness and much energy, looking first at Larry and then at Ah wow, he received no reply. The former shook his head, and the latter stared at him with a steady, dead intensity, as if he wished to stare him through. After a few minutes' pause, Larry suddenly asked the captain if he was hungry, to which the latter replied that he was, whereupon the former suggested that it was worth while cooking the haunch of venison, and offered to do it in a peculiar manner that had been taught to him not long ago by a hunter who had passed that way, and fallen into the hole in the tent and sprained his ankle, so that he, Larry, was obliged to "kape him for a week and trate him to the best o' the toime." The proposal was agreed to, and Larry, seizing the haunch, which was still covered with the mud contracted in the hole, proceeded to exhibit his powers as a cook. The rain, which had been coming down as if a second flood were about to deluge the earth, had ceased at this time, and the sun succeeded for a few hours in struggling through the murky clouds and pouring a flood of light and heat over hill and plain, the result of which was that along the whole length of Little Creek there was an eruption of blankets and shirts and inexpressibles and other garments which stood much in need of being dried, and which, as they fluttered and flapped their many-coloured folds in the light breeze, gave the settlement the appearance, as Captain Bunting expressed it, of being "dressed from stem to stern." The steam that arose from these habiliments, and from the soaking earth, and from the drenched forest, covered the face of nature with a sort of luminous mist that was quite cheering, by contrast with the leaden gloom that had preceded it, and filled with a romantic glow the bosoms of such miners as had any romance left in their natures. Larry O'Neil was one of these, and he went about his work whistling violently. We will not take upon us to say how much of his romance was due to the haunch of venison. We would not, if called on to do it, undertake to say how much of the romance and enjoyment of a picnic party would evaporate if it were suddenly announced that the hamper had been forgotten, or that it had fallen and the contents been smashed and mixed. We turn from such ungenerous and gross contemplations to the cooking of that haunch of venison, which, as it was done after a fashion never known to Sawyer, and may be useful in after years to readers of this chronicle, whose lot it may be perchance to stand in need of such knowledge, we shall carefully describe. It is not necessary to enlarge upon the preliminaries. We need hardly say that Larry washed off the mud, and that he passed flattering remarks upon his own abilities and prowess, and in very irreverent tones and terms addressed Ah wow, who smoked his pipe and looked at him. All that, and a great deal more, we leave to our reader's well-known and vivid imagination. Suffice it that the venison was duly washed, and a huge fire, with much difficulty, kindled, and a number of large stones put into it to heat. This done, Larry cut off a lump of meat from the haunch, a good deal larger than his own head, which wasn't small, the skin with the hair on being cut off along with the meat. A considerable margin of flesh was then pared off from the lump, so as to leave an edging of hide all round, which might overlap the remainder and enclose it, as it were, in a natural bag. At this stage of the process Larry paused, looked admiringly at his work, winked over the edge of it at Ah wow, and went hastily into the tent, whence he issued with 2 little tin canisters, one containing pepper, the other salt. "Why, you beat the French all to nothin'," remarked the captain, who sat on an upturned tea-box, smoking and watching the proceedings. "Ah, then, don't speak, captain; it'll spile your appetite," said Larry, sprinkling the seasoning into the bag, and closing it up by means of a piece of cord. He then drew the red-hot stones and ashes from the fire, and, making a hot-bed thereof, placed the venison dumpling, if we may be allowed the term, on the centre of it. Before the green hide was quite burned through, the dish was cooked, as Yankees express it, to a curiosity, and the tasting thereof would have evoked from an alderman a look, he would have been past speaking, of ecstasy, while a lady might have exclaimed, "Delicious!" or a schoolboy have said, or some such term which ought only to be used in reference to intellectual treats, and should never be applied to such low matters as meat and drink. Chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream, by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 23. The Rainy Season and its Effects. Disease and Misery at Little Creek. Reappearance of Old Friends. An Emigrant's Death. An Unexpected Arrival. Captain Bunting, after 2 days' serious consideration, made up his mind to go down alone to San Francisco, in order to clear up the mystery of the letter, and do all that he could personally in the absence of his friend. To resolve, however, was easy; to carry his resolution into effect was almost impracticable, in consequence of the inundated state of the country. It was now the middle of November, and the rainy season, which extends over 6 months of the year, was in full play. Language is scarcely capable of conveying, to those who have not seen it, an adequate idea of how it rained at this period of the year. It did not pour. There were no drops. It roared, a cataract of never-ending ramrods, as thick as your finger, straight down from the black sky right through to the very vitals of the earth. It struck the tents like shot, and spirited through the tightest canvas in the form of Scotch mist. It swept down cabin chimneys and put out the fires. It roared through every crevice and rent and seam of the hills in mad cataracts, and swelled up the little creek into a mighty surging river. All work was arrested. Men sat in their tents on mud heaps that melted from below them, or lay on logs that well nigh floated away with them. But there was not so much grumbling as one might have expected. It was too tremendous to be merely annoying. It was sublimely ridiculous. So men grinned and bore it. But there were many poor miners there, alas, who could not regard that season in a light manner. There were dozens of young and middle-aged men whose constitutions, although good perhaps, were not robust, and who ought never to have ventured to seek their fortunes in the gold regions. Men who might have lived their full time, and have served their day and generation usefully in the civilized regions of the world, but who, despite the advice of friends probably, and certainly despite the warnings of experienced travellers and authors, rushed eagerly to California to find, not a fortune, but a grave. Dysentery, scurvy in its worst and most loathsome type, ague, rheumatism, sciatica, consumption, and other diseases were now rife at the diggings, cutting down many a youthful plant, and blasting many a golden dream. Doctors, too, became surprisingly numerous, but these disciples of Aesculapius failed to effect cures, and as their diplomas, when sought for, were not forthcoming, they were ultimately banished en masse by the indignant miners. 1 or 2 old hunters and trappers turned out in the end to be the most useful doctors, and effected a good many cures with the simple remedies they had become acquainted with among the red men. What rendered things worse was that provisions became scarce, and therefore enormously dear. No fresh vegetables of any kind were to be had. Salt, greasy and rancid pork, bear's meat, and venison were all the poor people could procure, although many a man there would have given $1,000, ay, all he possessed, for a single meal of fresh potatoes. The men smitten with scurvy had, therefore, no chance of recovering. The valley became a huge hospital, and the banks of the stream a cemetery. There were occasional lulls, however, in this dismal state of affairs. Sometimes the rain ceased, the sun burst forth in irresistible splendour, and the whole country began to steam like a cauldron. A cart, too, succeeded now and then in struggling up with a load of fresh provisions, reviving a few sinking spirits for a time, and almost making the owner's fortune. But, at the best, it was a drearily calamitous season, one which caused many a sick heart to hate the sight and name of gold, and many a digger to resolve to quit the land and all its treasures at the first opportunity. Doubtless, too, many deep and earnest thoughts of life, and its aims and ends, filled the minds of some men at that time. It is often in seasons of adversity that God shows to men how mistaken their views of happiness are, and how mad as well as sinful it is in them to search for joy and peace apart from, and without the slightest regard for, the Author of all felicity. Yes, there is reason to hope and believe that many seeds of eternal life were sown by the Saviour, and watered by the Holy Spirit, in that disastrous time of disease and death, seed which, perhaps, is now blessing and fertilizing many distant regions of the world. In one of the smallest and most wretched of the huts, at the entrance of the valley of Little Creek, lay a man whose days on earth were evidently few. The hut stood apart from the others in a lonely spot, as if it shrank from observation, and was seldom visited by the miners, who were too much concerned about their own misfortunes to care much for those of others. Here Kate Morgan sat by the couch of her dying brother, endeavouring to soothe his last hours by speaking to him in the most endearing terms, and reading passages from the Word of God, which lay open on her knee. But the dying man seemed to derive little comfort from what she said or read. His restless eye roamed anxiously round the wretched hut, while his breath came short and thick from between his pale lips. "Shall I read to you, darling?" said the woman, bending over the couch to catch the faint whisper, which was all the poor man had strength to utter. Just then, ere he could reply, the clatter of hoofs was heard, and a bronzed, stalwart horseman was seen through the doorless entrance of the hut, approaching at a brisk trot. Both horse and man were of immense size, and they came on with that swinging, heavy tread which gives the impression of irresistible weight and power. The rider drew up suddenly, and, leaping off his horse, cried, "Can I have a draught of water, my good woman?" as he fastened the bridle to a tree and strode into the hut. Kate rose hurriedly, and held up her finger to impose silence, as she handed the stranger a can of water. But he had scarcely swallowed a mouthful when his eye fell on the sick man. Going gently forward to the couch, he sat down beside it, and, taking the invalid's wrist, felt his pulse. "Is he your husband?" inquired the stranger in a subdued voice. "No, sir, my brother." "Does he like to have the Bible read to him?" "Sometimes, but before his voice failed he was always crying out for the priest." "He's a Catholic, sir, though I'm not one myself, and thinks he can't be saved unless he sees the priest." The stranger took up the Bible, and, turning towards the man, whose bright eyes were fixed earnestly upon him, read, in a low, impressive voice, several of those passages in which a free salvation to the chief of sinners is offered through Jesus Christ. He did not utter a word of comment, but he read with deep solemnity, and paused ever and anon to look in the face of the sick man as he read the blessed words of comfort. The man was not in a state either to listen to arguments or to answer questions, so the stranger wisely avoided both, and gently quitted the hut after offering up a brief prayer, and repeating twice the words, "Jesus says, Him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out." Kate followed him out, and thanked him earnestly for his kindness, while tears stood in her eyes. "Have you no friends or relations here but him?" inquired the stranger. "Not one. There was one man as came to see us often when we stayed in a lonesome glen further up the creek, but we've not seen him since we came here. More be token he didn't know we were going to leave, and we went off in a hurry, for my poor brother was impatient, and thought the change would do him good. Take this, you'll be the better of it." The stranger thrust a quantity of silver into Kate's hand, and sprang upon his horse. "I don't need it, thank ye," said Kate hurriedly. "But you may need it. At any rate, he does. Stay, what was the name of the man who used to visit you?" "O'Neill, sir, Larry O'Neill." "Indeed! He is one of my mates. My name is Sinton, Edward Sinton. You will hear from me again ere long." Ned put spurs to his horse as he spoke, and in another moment was out of sight. CHAPTER 23. Chapter 24 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 24. Ned decides on visiting San Francisco. Larry pays a visit and receives a severe disappointment. The road and the city. Unexpected news. Few joys in this life are altogether without alloy. The delight experienced by Larry O'Neill and Captain Bunting when they heard the hearty tones of Ned Sinton's voice, and the satisfaction with which they beheld his face when, in their anxiety to prevent his falling headlong into the hole, they both sprang out of the tent and rushed into his arms, were somewhat damped on their observing that Tom Collins was not with him. But their anxieties were speedily relieved on learning that Tom was at Sacramento City, and, it was to be hoped, doing well. As Ned had eaten nothing on the day of his arrival since early morning, the first care of his friends was to cook some food for him, and Larry took special care to brew for him, as soon as possible, a stiff tumbler of hot brandy and water, which, as he was wet and weary, was particularly acceptable. While enjoying this over the fire in front of the tent, Ned related the adventures of himself and Tom Collins circumstantially, in the course of which narration he explained what the reader does not yet know, how that, after Tom had recovered from his illness sufficiently to ride, he had conducted him by easy stages to the banks of the great San Joaquin River, down which they had proceeded by boat until they reached Sacramento. Here Ned saw him comfortably settled in the best room of the best hotel in the town, and then, purchasing the largest and strongest horse he could find, he set off, in spite of the rains, to let his comrades know that they were both safe, and, in Ned's case at least, sound. And now, with reference to that letter. "Ah, that letter," echoed the captain. "That's what I've been wanting you to come to. What can it mean?" "I am as ignorant of that as yourself," answered Ned. "If it had only been you who were mentioned in the letter, I could have supposed that your old ship had been relaunched and refitted, and had made a successful voyage to China during your absence; but as I left no property of any kind in San Francisco, and had no speculations afloat, I cannot conceive what it can be." "Maybe," suggested Larry, "they've heard o' our remarkable talents up here in the diggin's, and they've been successful in getting us app'inted to responsible sitations in the new government I've heard they're settin' up down there. I wouldn't object to be Prime Minister myself, if they'd only allow me enough clerks to do the work." "And did you say you were all ready for a start to-morrow, captain?" inquired Ned. "Quite. We've disposed of the claims and tools for $1,500, and we sold our wow along with the lot. That's to say, he remains a fixture at the same wage, and the little we meant to take with us is stowed away in our saddle bags. You see, I couldn't foresee that you'd plump down on us in this fashion, and I felt that the letter was urgent and ought to be acted on at once." "You did quite right," returned Ned. "What a pity I missed seeing Bill Jones at Sacramento! But the city has grown so much, and become so populous in a few months, that two friends might spend a week in it unknown to each other, without chancing to meet. And now, as to the gold. Have you been successful since I left?" "Ay," broke in Larry, "that have we. It's a great country entirely for men whose bones and muscles are made o' iron. We've dug $40,000, £8,000 out of that same hole in the tent, for by spraining the ankles and well nigh breaking the legs o' 8 or 10 miners. It's sorry I'll be to leave it, but after all it's a sickly place, so I'm content to go." "By the way, Larry, that reminds me, I met a friend of yours at the other end of the settlement." "I believe ye," answered Larry. "Ivery man in the Creek's me friend. They'd die for me, they would, if I only axed them." "Ay, but a particular friend, named Kate, who—" "Och! ye don't mane it!" cried the Irishman, starting up with an anxious look. "Sure, they lived up in the dark glen there, and they went off one fine day, and I've niver been able to hear of them since." "They are not very far off," continued Ned, detailing his interview with the brother and sister, and expressing a conviction that the former could not now be in life. "We'll go down to night," said Larry, drawing on his heavy boots. "You'd better wait till to morrow," suggested the captain. "The poor thing will be in no humour to see any one to night, and we can make a halt near the hut for an hour or so." Larry, with some reluctance, agreed to this delay, and the rest of the evening was spent by the little party in making preparations for a start on the following day. But difficulties arose in the way of settling with the purchasers of their claims, so that another day passed ere they got fairly off on their journey towards Sacramento. On reaching the mouth of the little creek, Larry O'Neil galloped ahead of his companions, and turned aside at the little hut, the locality of which Sinton had described to him minutely. Springing off his horse, he threw the reins over a bush and crossed the threshold. It is easier to conceive than to describe his amazement and consternation on finding the place empty. Dashing out, he vaulted into the saddle, and almost galloped through the doorway of the nearest hut in his anxiety to learn what had become of his friends. "Hillo, stranger!" shouted a voice from within. "No thoroughfare this way, and I wouldn't advise ye for to go and try for to make one. Ha, countryman, where's the sick Irishman and his sister going that lived close to ye here?" "Wall, they ain't a countryman o' yourn, I guess, but I can answer a civil question. They're gone. The man's dead, and the gal took him away in a cart, day before yesterday." "Gone? Took him away in a cart?" echoed Larry, while he looked aghast at the man. "Are you sure?" "Well, I couldn't be sure. I made the coffin for him, and helped to lift it into the cart." "But where have they gone to?" "To Sacramento, I guess. I advised her not to go, but she mumbled something about not having him buried in such a wild place, and laying him in a churchyard, so I gave her the loan of $50. It was all I could spare, for she hadn't a rap. She borrowed the horse and cart from a countryman who was going to Sacramento at any rate." "You're a trump, you are," cried Larry with energy. "Give us your hand, me boy. Oh, then your parents were Irish, I'll be bound. Now, here's your $50 back again, with compound interest to boot, though I don't know exactly what that is." "I didn't ask you for the $50," said the man, somewhat angrily. "Who are you that offers 'em?" "I'm her friend," answered Larry, in some confusion. "Her intimate friend. I might almost say a sort of distant relation, only not quite that." "Well, if that's all, I guess I'm as much a friend as you," said the man, re-entering his cabin and shutting the door with a bang. Larry sighed, dropped the $50 into his leather purse, and galloped away. The journey down to Sacramento, owing to the flooded state of the country, was not an easy one. It took the party several days' hard riding to accomplish it, and during all that time Larry kept a vigilant look-out for Kate Morgan and the cart, but neither of them did he see. Each day he felt certain he would overtake them, but each evening found him trying to console himself with the reflection that a stern chase is proverbially a long one, and that next day would do it. Thus they struggled on, and finally arrived at the city of Sacramento without having set eyes on the wanderer. Poor Larry little knew that, having gone with a man who knew the road thoroughly, Kate, although she travelled slowly, had arrived there the day before him, while Ned had lengthened the road by unwittingly making a considerable and unnecessary detour. Still less did he know that, at the very hour he arrived in the city, Kate, with her sad charge, embarked on board a small river steamer, and was now on her way to San Francisco. As it was, Larry proposed to start back again, supposing they must have passed them, but on second thoughts he decided to remain where he was and make inquiries. So the three friends pushed forward to the City Hotel to make inquiries after Tom Collins. "Mr. Collins?" said the waiter, bowing to Sinton. "He's gone, sir, about a week ago." "Gone!" exclaimed Ned, turning pale. "Yes, sir, gone down to San Francisco. He saw some advertisement or other in the newspaper, and started off by the next steamer." Ned's heart beat freely again. "Was he well when he left?" "Yes, sir, pretty well. He would have been the better of a longer rest, but he was quite fit to travel, sir." Captain Bunting, who, during this colloquy, had been standing with his legs apart, and his eyes glaring at the waiter as if he had been mad, gave a prolonged whistle, but made no further remark. At this moment Larry, who had been conversing with one of the under waiters, came rushing in with a look of desperation on his countenance. "Would you belave it," he cried, throwing himself down on a splendid crimson sofa, that seemed very much out of keeping with the dress of the rough miners whom it was meant to accommodate. "Would you belave it, they're gone!" "Who are gone, and where to?" inquired Ned. "Kate and the coffin. Off to San Francisco be all that's unlucky, and only went little more nor an hour ago." The three friends looked at each other. "Waiter," said Captain Bunting, in a solemn voice, "bear chops for 3, pipes and baccy for 6, and a brandy smash for 1. And, d'ye hear, let it be stiff." "Yes, sir." A loud laugh from Ned and Larry relieved their over-excited and pent-up feelings, and both agreed that, under the circumstances, the captain's order was the best that could be given at that stage of their perplexities. Having ascertained that there was not another steamer to San Francisco for a week, they resolved to forget their anxieties as much as possible, and enjoy themselves in the great city of Sacramento during the next few days, while they instituted inquiries as to what had become of their comrade, Bill Jones, who they concluded must still be in the city, as they had not met him on the way down. Chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 25. Gold Not All Powerful. Remarkable growth of Sacramento. New style of bringing a hotel into notice. A surprising discovery. Death of a Mexican horse tamer. The concert and another discovery. Mademoiselle Nelina creates a sensation. It is said that gold can accomplish anything, and in some respects the saying is full of truth. In some points of view, however, the saying is altogether wrong. Gold can indeed accomplish almost anything in the material world. It can purchase stone, and metal, and timber, and muscles, bones, thews, and sinews with life in them to any extent. It can go a step further. It can purchase brains, intellect, genius, and, throwing the whole together, material and immaterial, it can cut and carve and mould the world to such an extent that its occupants of 50 years ago, were they permitted to return to earth, would find it hard to recognize the scene of their brief existence. But there are things and powers which gold cannot purchase. That worn-out old millionaire would give tons of it for a mere tithe of the health that yonder ploughman enjoys. Youth cannot be bought with gold. Time cannot be purchased with gold. The prompt obedience of thousands of men and women may be bought with that precious metal, but one powerful throb of a loving heart could not be procured by all the yellow gold that ever did or ever will enrich the human family. But we are verging towards digression. Let us return to the simple idea with which we intended to begin this chapter, the wonder-working power of gold. In no country in the wide world, we venture to affirm, has this power been exemplified so strikingly as in California. The knowledge of the discovery of gold was so suddenly and widely disseminated over the earth, that human beings flowed into the formerly uninhabited wilderness like a mighty torrent, while thousands of ships flooded the markets with the necessaries of life. Then gold was found to be so abundant, and at first so easily procured, that the fever was kept up at white heat for several years. The result of this was, as we have remarked elsewhere, that changes worthy of Aladdin's lamp or Harlequin's wand were wrought in the course of a few weeks, sometimes in a few days. The city of Sacramento was one of the most remarkable of the many strange and sudden growths in the country. The river on which it stands is a beautiful stream, from 200 to 300 yards wide, and navigable by large craft to a few miles above the city. The banks, when our friends were there, were fringed with rich foliage, and the wild trees of the forest itself stood growing in its streets. The city was laid out in the form of a square, with streets crossing each other at right angles. A forest of masts along the Embarcadero attested the growing importance and wealth of the place, and nearly 10,000 inhabitants swarmed in its streets. Many of those streets were composed of canvas tents, or erections scarcely more durable. Yet here, little more than a year before, there were only 4,000 in the place. Those who chanced to be in possession of the land here were making fortunes. Lots, 20 feet by 70, in the best situations, brought upwards of $3,500. Rents, too, were enormous. One hotel paid $30,000, £6,000 per annum; another $35,000. Small stores fetched $10,000 and $12,000 a year, while board at the best hotels was $5 a day. Truly, if gold was plentiful, it was needed, for the common necessaries of life, though plentiful, were bought and sold at fabulous prices. The circulation of gold was enormous, and the growth of the city did not suffer a check even for a day, although the cost of building was unprecedented. And this commercial prosperity continued in spite of the fact that the place was unhealthy, being a furnace in summer, and in winter little better than a swamp. "It's a capital hotel," remarked Captain Bunting to his companions, as they sat round their little table, enjoying their pipes after dinner. "I wonder if they make a good thing out of it." "Sure if they don't," said Larry, tilting his chair on its hind legs, and calmly blowing a cloud of smoke towards the roof. "It's a losin' game they're playin', for they sarve out the grub at a tearin' pace." "They are doing well, I doubt not," said Ned Sinton, "and they deserve to, for the owner, or owners, I don't know how many or few there are, made a remarkable and enterprising start." "How was that?" asked the captain. "I heard of it when I was down here with Tom," continued Sinton. "You must know that this was the first regular hotel opened in the city, and it was considered so great an event that it was celebrated by salvos of artillery, and, on the part of the proprietors, by a great unlimited feast to all who chose to come." "What!" cried Larry, "free, gratis, for nothin'?" "Ay, for nothin'. It was done in magnificent style, I assure you. Any one who chose came and called for what he wanted, and got it at once. The attendance was prompt, and as cheerfully given as though it had been paid for. Gin slings, cocktails, mint juleps, and brandy smashes went round like a circular storm; even champagne flowed like water; and venison, wild fowl, salmon, grizzly bear steaks, and pastry all the delicacies of the season, in short, were literally to be had for the asking. What it cost the spirited proprietors I know not, but certainly it was a daring stroke of genius that deserved patronage." "Faix, it did," said Larry, emphatically. "An' they shall have it too. Here, waiter, a brandy smash and a cheroot, and be aisy as to the cost. I think me bank'll stand it." "What say you to a stroll?" said Ned, rising. "By all means," replied Captain Bunting, jumping up and laying down his pipe. Larry preferred to remain where he was, so the two friends left him to enjoy his cheroot, and wandered away, where fancy led, to see the town. There was much to be seen. It required no theatrical representation of life to amuse one in Sacramento at that time. The whole city was a vast series of plays in earnest. Every conceivable species of comedy and farce met the eye at every turn; costumes the most remarkable, men the most varied and peculiar, and things the most incomprehensible and unexpected presented themselves in endless succession. Here a canvas restaurant stood, or rather leaned against a log store; there a tent spread its folds in juxtaposition to a deck cabin, which seemed to have walked ashore from a neighbouring brig, without leave, and had been let out as a grog shop by way of punishment. Chinamen in calico jostled sailors in canvas, or diggers in scarlet flannel shirts, or dandies in broadcloth and patent leather, or Red Indians in nothing. Bustle and hurry and uproar and joviality prevailed. A good deal of drinking, too, unfortunately went on, and the results were occasional melodramas, and sometimes serious rows. Tragedies, too, were enacted, but these seldom met the eye. As is usually the case, they were done in the dark. "What have we here?" cried Captain Bunting, stopping before a large placard, and reading, "Grand concert this evening. Wonderful singer. Mademoiselle Nelina, first appearance. Ethiopian serenaders. I say, Ned, we must go to this. I've not heard a song for ages that was worth listening to." "At what hour?" inquired Ned. "Oh, 7 o'clock. Well, we can stroll back to the hotel, have a cup of coffee, and bring Larry O'Neil with us. Come along." That evening our three adventurers occupied the back seat of a large concert room in one of the most crowded thoroughfares of the town, patiently awaiting the advent of the performers. The room was filled to overflowing, long before the hour for the commencement of the performances, with every species of mortal except woman. Women were exceedingly rare creatures at that time. The meetings of all sorts were composed almost entirely of men, in their varied and motley garbs. Considering the circumstances in which it was got up, the room was a very creditable one, destitute indeed of ornament, but well lighted by an enormous wooden chandelier full of wax candles, which depended from the centre of the ceiling. At the further end of the room was a raised stage, with footlights in front, and 3 chairs in the middle of it. There was a small orchestra in front, consisting of 2 fiddles, a cornopian, a trombone, a clarionet, and a flute; but at first the owners of these instruments kept out of sight, wisely reserving themselves until that precise moment when the impatient audience would, as all audiences do on similar occasions, threatened to bring down the building with stamping of feet, accompanied with steam engine-like whistles and savage cries of "Music!" While Ned Sinton and his friends were quietly looking round upon the crowd, Larry O'Neill's attention was arrested by the conversation of two men who sat just in front of him. One was a rough-looking miner in a wide-awake and red flannel shirt. The other was a negro in a shirt of blue striped calico. "Who be this Missy Nelina?" inquired the negro, turning to his companion. "I dun know, but I was here last night, and I'd take my davy I saw the little gal in the ranch of a feller away in the plains 500 miles to the east'ard 2 months ago. Her father, poor chap, was killed by a wild horse." "How was that?" inquired the negro, with an expression of great interest. "Well, it was this way it happened," replied the other, putting a quid of tobacco into his cheek, such as only a sailor would venture to masticate. "I was up at the diggin's about 6 months, without getting more gold than just kept me in life, for you see I was always an unlucky dog, when one day I goes down to my claim, and at the very first lick dug up 2 chunks of gold as big as your fists. So I sold my claim and shovel, and come down here for a spree. Well, as I was sayin', I come to the ranch of a feller called Banji, or Bonji, or Bunji, or some sort o' bang with a G at the end o' it. He was clappin' his little gal on the head when I comed up, and said good bye to her. I didn't rightly hear what she said, but I was so taken with her pretty face that I couldn't help askin' if the little thing was his'n. "Yees," says he, for he was a Mexican, and couldn't come round the English lingo. "She me daughter. I found the man was goin' to catch a wild horse, so says I'll go with you, and says he, come along. So away we went, slappin' over the plains at a great rate, him and me, and a Yankee, a friend of his, and 3 or 4 servants, after a drove of wild horses that had been seen that mornin' near the house. Well, away we went after the wild horses. Oh, it was grand sport! The man had lent me one of his beasts, and it went at such a spankin' pace I could scarce keep my seat, and had to hold on by the saddle, not bein' used to ridin' much, d'ye see. We soon picked out a horse, a splendid lookin' feller, with curved neck, and free gallop, and wide nostrils. My eye, how he did snort and plunge when the Mexican threw the lasso! It went right over his head the first cast, but the wild horse pulled the rope out of his grip. It's all up, thought I, but niver a bit. The Mexican put spurs to his horse, and, while at full gallop, made a dive with his body, and actually caught the end of the line as it trailed over the ground, and recovered his seat again. It was done in a crack, and I believe he held on by means of his spurs, which were big enough, I think, to make wheels for a small carronade. Taking a turn of the line round the horn of his saddle, he reined in a bit, and then gave the spurs for another spurt, and soon after reined in again. In fact, he just played the wild horse like a trap, until he well nigh choked him, and in an hour or less he was led steamin', and startin', and jumpin', into the corral where the man kept his other horses. At this point in the narrative the cries for music became so deafening that the sailor was obliged to pause, to the evident annoyance of the negro, who seemed intensely interested in what he had heard, and also to the regret of Larry, who had listened eagerly the whole time. In a few minutes the music came in the shape of 2 bald-headed Frenchmen, a wild-looking bearded German, and several lean men who might, as far as appearance went, have belonged to almost any nation, and who would have, as far as musical ability went, been repudiated by every nation, except perhaps the Chinese. During the quarter of an hour in which these performers quieted the impatient audience with sweet sounds, the sailor continued his anecdote. "Well, you see," said he to the negro, while Larry bent forward to listen, "the Mexican mounted, and raced, and spurred him for about an hour, but just at the last the wild horse gave a tremendous leap and a plunge, and we noticed the rider fall forward as if he'd got a sprain. The Yankee and one of the servants ran up and caught the horse by the head, but its rider didn't move. He was stone dead, and was held in his seat by the spurs sticking in the saddle cloth. The last bound must have ruptured some blood vessel inside, for there was no sign of hurt upon him anywhere." "You don't say that," said the negro, with a look of horror. "'Deed do I; and we took the poor feller home, where his little daughter cried for him as if she'd break her heart. I asked Yankee what we should do, but he looked at me somewhat offended like, and said he was a relation of the dead man's wife, and could manage the affairs of the family without help; so I bid him good morning, and went my way. But I believe in my heart he was tellin' a lie, and that he's no right to go hawking the poor gal about the country in this fashion." Larry was deeply interested in this narrative, and felt so strong a disposition to make further inquiries, that he made up his mind to question the sailor, and was about to address him when a small bell tinkled, the music ceased, and 3 Ethiopian minstrels, banjo in hand, advanced to the footlights, made their bow, and then seated themselves on the 3 chairs, with that intensity of consummate, impudent, easy familiarity peculiar to the ebony sons of song. "Go to it, darkies!" shouted an enthusiastic individual in the middle of the room. "3 cheers for the niggers!" roared a sailor, who had just returned from a 12 months' cruise at the mines, and whose delight at the prospect of once more hearing a good song was quite irrepressible. The audience responded to the call with shouts of laughter, and a cheer that would have done your heart good to listen to, while the niggers shewed their teeth in acknowledgment of the compliment. The first song was "Lily Dale," and the men, who we need scarcely say were fictitious negroes, sang it so well that the audience listened with breathless attention and evident delight, and encored it vociferously. The next song was "Oh, Massa, how he wopped me," a ditty of quite a different stamp, but equally popular. It also was encored, as indeed was every song sung that evening, but the performers had counted on this. After the third song there was a hornpipe, in the performance of which the dancer's chief aim seemed to be to show in what a variety of complex ways he could shake himself to pieces if he chose. Then there was another trio, and then a short pause, in order duly to prepare the public mind for the reception of the great cantatrice, Mademoiselle Nelina. When she was led to the footlights by the tallest of the 3 negroes, there was a momentary pause, as if men caught their breath. Then there was a prolonged cheer of enthusiastic admiration; and little wonder, for the creature that appeared before these rough miners seemed more like an angelic visitant than a mortal. There was nothing strikingly beautiful about the child, but she possessed that inexpressibly sweet character of face that takes the human heart by storm at first sight, and this, added to the fact that she was almost the only one of her sex who had been seen for many months by any of those present, that she was fair, blue-eyed, delicate, modestly dressed, and innocent, filled them with an amount of enthusiasm that would have predisposed them to call a scream melodious, had it been uttered by Mademoiselle Nelina. But the voice which came timidly from her lips was in harmony with her appearance. There was no attempt at execution, and the poor child was too frightened to succeed in imparting much expression to the simple ballad which she warbled. But there was an inherent richness in the tones of her voice that entranced the ear, and dwelt for weeks and months afterwards on the memory of those who heard it that night. It is needless to add that all her songs were encored with rapturous applause. The second song she sang was the popular one, "Erin, my country," and it created quite a furore among the audience, many of whom were natives of the Green Isle. "Oh, ye purty creature, sing it again, do!" yelled an Irishman in the front seats, while he waved his hat and cheered in mad enthusiasm. The multitude shouted "Encore," and the song was sung for the 3rd time. While it was singing, Larry O'Neil sat with his hands clasped before him, his bosom heaving, and his eyes riveted on the child's face. "Mr Sinton," he said, in a deep, earnest tone, touching Ned on the shoulder, as the last sweet notes of the air were drowned in the thunder of applause that followed Mademoiselle Nelina off the stage, "Mr Sinton, I'd lay me life that it's her." "Who?" inquired Ned, smiling at the serious expression of his comrade's face. "Who but Nelly Morgan, of course. She's the born image o' Kate. They're as like as 2 peas. Sure, if it's her, I'll know it, I will; and I'll make that black thief of a Yankee captain explain how he come to possess stolen goods." Ned and the captain at first expressed doubts as to Larry's being able to swear to the identity of one whom he had never seen before, but the earnest assurances of the Irishman convinced them that he must be right, and they at once entered into his feelings, and planned, in an eager undertone, how the child was to be communicated with. "It won't do," said Ned, "to tax the man right out with his villainy. The miners would say we wanted to get possession of the child to make money by her." "But if the child herself admitted that the man was not her relative?" suggested Captain Bunting. "Perhaps," returned Ned, "she might at the same time admit that she didn't like the appearance of the strangers who made such earnest inquiries about her, and prefer to remain with her present guardian." "Never fear," said Larry, in a hoarse whisper. "She'll not say that if I tell her I know her sister Kate, and can take her to her. Besides, hasn't she got an Irish heart? And don't I know the way to touch it? Just stay where you are, both of you, and I'll go behind the scenes. The niggers are comin' on again, so I'll try. Maybe there's nobody there but herself." Before they could reply, Larry was gone. In a few minutes he reached the front seats, and, leaning his back against the wall, as if he were watching the performers, he gradually edged himself into the dark corner where the side curtains shut off the orchestra from the public. To his great satisfaction he found that this was only secured to the wall by one or two nails, which he easily removed, and then, in the midst of an uproarious laugh, caused by a joke of the serenaders, he pushed the curtain aside, and stood before the astonished gaze of Mademoiselle Nelina, who sat on a chair with her hands clasped and resting on her knee. Unfortunately for the success of Larry's enterprise, he also stood before the curtain raiser, a broad, sturdy man in rough miner's costume, whose back was turned towards him, but whose surprised visage instantly faced him on hearing the muffled noise caused by his entry. There was a burly negro also in the place, seated on a small stool, who looked at him with unqualified astonishment. "Hello! What do you want?" exclaimed the curtain raiser. "Tearin' ages!" cried Larry, in amazement. "May I niver! Sure, it's dreamin' I am, and the ghost o' Bill Jones is come to see me." It was indeed no other than Bill Jones who stood revealed before him, but no friendly glance of recognition did his old comrade vouchsafe him. He continued, after the first look of surprise, to frown steadily on the intruder. "You've the advantage of me, young man," said Bill, in a stern though subdued tone, for he feared to disturb the men on the stage. "Moreover, you've comed in where you've no right to be. When a man goes where he shouldn't ought to, and things looks as if they wasn't all square, in them circumstances, blow high or blow low, I always goes straight for'ard and shoves him out. If he don't shove easy, why, put on more steam, that's what I say." "But sure you don't forget me, Bill?" pleaded Larry, in amazement. "Well, p'raps I don't, and p'raps I do. When I last enjoyed the dishonour o' your acquaintance, you was a blackguard. It ain't likely you're improved, so be good enough to back your topsails and clear out." Bill Jones pointed as he spoke to the opening through which Larry had entered, but suddenly changing his mind, he said, "Hold on, there's a back door, and it'll be easier to kick you through that than through the concert room." So saying, Bill seized Larry O'Neil by the collar, and led that individual, in a state of helpless and wondering consternation, through a back door, where, however, instead of kicking him out, he released him, and suddenly changed his tone to an eager whisper. "Oh, Larry, lad, I'm glad to see you. Wherever did you come from? I've no time to speak. Uncle Ned's just buried, and Jim Crow comes on in 3 minutes. I had to pretend, you know, 'cause it wouldn't do to let Jim see I knowed you. That was him on the stool. I know what brought you here, and I've found out who she is. Where do you stop?" Larry's surprise just permitted him to gasp out the words "City Hotel," when a roar of laughter and applause met their ears, followed by the tinkle of a small bell. Bill sprang through the doorway, and slammed the door in his old comrade's face. It would be difficult to say, looking at that face on that particular time, whether the owner thereof was mad or drunk, or both, so strangely did it wrinkle and contort as it gradually dawned upon its owner that Bill Jones, true to his present profession, was acting a part; that he knew about the mystery of Mademoiselle Nelina; was now acquainted with his, Larry's, place of abode, and would infallibly find him out after the concert was over. As these things crossed his mind, Larry smote his thigh so often and so vigorously that he ran the risk of being taken up for unwarrantably discharging his revolver in the streets, and he whistled once or twice so significantly that at least 5 stray dogs answered to the call. At last he hitched up the band of his trousers, and, hastening round to the front door, essayed to re-enter the concert room. "Pay here, please," cried the money-taker, in an extremely nasal tone, as he passed the little hole in the wall. "We've paid already," answered Larry. "Show your cheque, then." "Sure, I don't know what that is." The doorkeeper smiled contemptuously, and shut down with a bang the bar that kept off the public. Larry doubled his fist and flushed crimson. Then he remembered the importance of the business he had on hand, and quietly drew the requisite sum from his leather purse. "Come along," said he to Ned Sinton, on re-entering the room. "I've seed her. And Bill Jones, too." "Bill Jones!" cried Ned and the captain simultaneously. "Whist!" said Larry. "Don't be making people obsarve us. Come along home, it's all right. We'll tell you all about it when we're out." In another minute the 3 friends were in the street, conversing eagerly and earnestly as they hastened to their quarters through the thronged and noisy streets of Sacramento. Chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 26. Deep Plots and Plans. Bill Jones relates his misadventures. Mademoiselle Nelina consents to run off with Larry O'Neil. A Yankee musician outwitted. The escape. As Larry had rightly anticipated, Bill Jones made his appearance at the City Hotel the moment the concert was over, and found his old comrades waiting anxiously for him. It did not take long to tell him how they had discovered the existence of Nellie Morgan, as we shall now call her, but it took much longer to drag from Bill the account of his career since they last met, and the explanation of how he came to be placed in his present circumstances. "You see, friends," said he, puffing at a pipe, from which, to look at him, one would suppose he derived most of his information, "this is how it happened. When I set sail from the diggings to come here for grub, I had a pleasant trip at first, but after a little things began to look bad. The feller that steered us lost his reckoning, and so we took 2 or 3 wrong turns by way of making short cuts. That's always how it is. There's a proverb somewhere." "In Milton, maybe, or Napier's Book o' Logarithms," suggested Captain Bunting. "P'raps it was, and p'raps it wasn't," retorted Bill, stuffing the end of his little finger, if such a diminutive may be used in reference to any of his fingers, into the bowl of his pipe. "I rayther think myself it was in Bell's Life or the Royal Almanac. Howsever, that's what it is. When you've got a short road to go, don't try to make it shorter, say I. And when you've got a long story to tell, don't try to make it longer," interrupted Larry, winking at his comrade through the smoke of his pipe. "Well, as I was sayin'," continued Bill doggedly, "we didn't get on so well after a bit, but somehow or other we got here at last, and cast anchor in this very hotel. Off I goes at once and buys a cart and a mule, and then I sets to work to lay in provisions. Now, d'ye see, lads, 'twould have been better if I had bought the provisions first, and the mule and the cart after, for I had to pay ever so many dollars a day for their keep. At last I got it all square, packed tight and tied up in the cart, barrels of flour, and kegs of pork, and beans, and brandy, and what not, and away I went alone, for, d'ye see, I carry a compass, and when I've once made a voyage, I never need to be told how to steer. But my troubles began soon. There's a ford across the river here which I was told I'd have to cross, and sure enough so I did, but it's as bad as Niagara, if not worse, and when I gets half-way over, we was capsized, and went down the river keel up. I dunno yet very well how I got ashore, but I did somehow." "And did the cart go for it?" inquired Captain Bunting, aghast. "No, the cart didn't. She's stranded half a mile further down, on a rock, where she lies to this hour, with the wheels smashed and the bottom out, and about 3,000 tons of water swashing right through her every hour. But all the provisions and the mule went slap down the Sacramento, and if they haven't been picked up on the way, they're cruising off the port of San Francisco by this time." The unfortunate seaman stopped at this point to relight his pipe, while his comrades laughingly commented on his misadventure. "Ah, you may laugh, but I can tell you it weren't a thing to be laughed at, and at this hour I've scarce $1 to rub against another." "Never mind, my boy," said Ned, as he and the others laughed loud and long at the lugubrious visage of their comrade. "We've got well-lined pockets, I assure you, and of course we have your share of the profits of our joint concern to hand over whenever you wish it." The expression of Bill Jones's face was visibly improved by this piece of news, and he went on with much greater animation. "Well, my story's short now. I comed back here, and by chance fell in with this feller, this Yankee nigger, who offered me $5 a day to haul up the curtain, and do a lot of dirty work, such as bill sticking, and lighting the candles, and sweeping the floor. But it's hard work, I tell you, to live on so little in such a place as this, where everything's so dear." "You're not good at a bargain, I fear," remarked Sinton. "But what of the little girl?" "Well, I was comin' to that. You see, I felt sure from some things I overheard that she wasn't the man's daughter, so one day I axed her who she was, and she said she didn't know, except that her name was Nellie Morgan. So it comed across me that Morgan was the name of the Irish family you was so thick with up at the diggings, Larry, and I was goin' to ask if she knowed them, when Jolly, that's the name of the getter up at the concerts, catched me talkin', and he took her away sharp, and said he'd thank me to leave the girl alone. I've been watchin' to have another talk with her, but Jolly's too sharp for me, and I haven't spoken to her yet." Larry manifested much disappointment at this termination, for he had been fully prepared to hear that the girl had made Bill her confidant, and would be ready to run away with him at a moment's notice. However, he consoled himself by saying that he would do the thing himself, and, after arranging that Bill was to tell Nellie that a friend of his knew where her sister was, and would like to speak with her, they all retired to rest, at least to rest as well as they could in a house which, like all the houses in California, swarmed with rats. Next night Bill Jones made a bold effort, and succeeded in conveying Larry's message to Nellie very adroitly, as he thought, while she was standing close to him, waiting for Mr Jolly to lead her to the footlights. The consequence was that the poor child trembled like a leaf when she attempted to sing, and finally fainted on the stage, to the consternation of a crowded house. The point was gained, however. Nellie soon found an opportunity of talking in private with Bill Jones, and appointed to meet Larry in the street next morning early, near the City Hotel. It was with trembling eagerness, mixed with timidity, that she took the Irishman's arm when they met, and asked if he really knew where her sister was. "Oh, how I've longed for her! But are you sure you know her?" "Know her!" said Larry with a smile. "Do I know meself?" This argument was unanswerable, so Nellie made no reply, and Larry went on. "Yes, I know her, and faix I hope to know her better. But here's her picture for you." Larry then gave the earnest listener at his side a graphic description of her sister Kate's personal appearance, and described her brother also, but he did not at that time acquaint her with the death of the latter. He also spoke of Black Jim, and described the circumstances of her being carried off. "So you see, darlin'," said he, "I know all about you, and now I want you to tell me what happened to you after that." "It's a sad story," said the child in a low tone, as if her mind were recalling melancholy incidents in her career. Then she told rapidly how she had been forsaken by those to whom she had been entrusted, and left to perish in the mountain snow, and how, in her extremity, God had sent help, how another party of emigrants found her and carried her on, how, one by one, they all died, till she was left alone a second time, and how a Mexican horseman found her and carried her to his home, and kept her there as his adopted daughter, till he was killed while taming a wild horse. After that, Nelly's story was a repetition of what Larry had already overheard accidentally in the concert room. "Now, dear," said Larry, "we haven't time to waste. Will you go with me to San Francisco?" The tones of the rough man's voice, rather than his words, had completely won the confidence of the poor child, so she said "Yes" without hesitation. "But how am I to escape from Mr Jolly?" she added. "He has begun to suspect Mr Jones, I say, quite well." "Lave that to me, darlin', and do you kape as much as you can in the house the next day or two, and be lookin' out for what may turn up. Good day to ye, mavourneen. We must part here for fear we're seen by any lynx-eyed blackguards. Kape up your heart." Nelly walked quickly away, half laughing at and half perplexed by the ambiguity of her new friend's parting advice. The four friends now set themselves to work to outwit Mr Jolly and rob him of Mademoiselle Nelina. At last they hit upon a device, which did not indeed say much for the ingenuity of the party, but which, like many other bold plans, succeeded admirably. A steamer was to start in 3 days for San Francisco, one of those splendid new vessels which, like floating palaces, had suddenly made their appearance on these distant waters, having made the long and dangerous voyage from the United States round the Horn. Before the steamer started, Larry contrived to obtain another interview with Nelly Morgan, and explained their plan, which was as follows. On the day of the steamer's sailing, a few hours before the time of starting, Mr Jolly was to receive the following letter, dated from a well-known ranch 30 miles up the river. "Sir, I trust that you will forgive a perfect stranger addressing you, but the urgency of the case must be my excuse. There is a letter lying here for you, which I have reason to know contains information of the utmost importance to yourself, but which, owing to circumstances that I dare not explain in a letter that might chance to fall into wrong hands, must be opened here by your own hands. It will explain all when you arrive. Meanwhile, as I am a perfect stranger to the state of your finances, I send you a sufficient quantity of gold dust by the bearer to enable you to hire a horse and come up. Pray excuse the liberty I take, and believe me to be your obedient servant, "Edward Sinton." At the appointed time Larry delivered this epistle, and the bag of gold, into Mr Jolly's hands, and, saying that no answer was required, hurried away. If Mr Jolly had been suddenly informed that he had been appointed Secretary of State to the King of Ashantee, he could not have looked more astonished than when he perused this letter, and weighed the bag of gold in his hand. The letter itself, had it arrived alone, might, very likely would, have raised his suspicions, but, accompanied as it was by a bag of gold of considerable value, it commended itself as a genuine document, and the worthy musician was in the saddle half an hour later. Before starting, he cautioned Nelly not to quit the house on any account whatever, a caution which she heard but did not reply to. 3 hours later Mr Jolly reached his destination, and had the following letter put into his hands. "Sir, by the time you receive this, your late charge, Mademoiselle Nelina, will be on her way to San Francisco, where you are welcome to follow her, and claim her from her sister, if you feel so disposed. I am, sir, etc., Edward Sinton." We need not repeat what Mr Jolly said, or try to imagine what he felt on receipt of this letter. About the time it was put into his hands, the magnificent steamer at the Embarcadero gave a shrill whistle, then it panted violently, the paddles revolved, and our adventurers were soon steaming swiftly down the noble river on their way to San Francisco. CHAPTER 27 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream, by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 27. San Francisco again. A terrible misfortune. An old friend in surprisingly new circumstances. Several remarkable discoveries and new lights. There is no time or place perhaps more suitable for indulging in ruminations, cogitations, and reminiscences than the quiet hours of a calm night out upon the sea, when the watchful stars look down upon the bosom of the deep and twinkle at their reflections in placid brilliancy. Late at night, when all the noisy inmates of the steamer had ceased to eat and drink and laugh, and had sought repose in their berths, Edward Sinton walked the deck alone, meditating on the past, the present, and the future. When he looked up at the serene heavens and down at the tranquil sea, whose surface was unruffled, save by the long, pure white track of the vessel, he could scarcely bring himself to believe that the whirl of incident and adventure in which he had been involved during the last few and short months was real. It seemed like a brilliant dream. As long as he was on shore it all appeared real enough, and the constant pressure of something to be done, either immediately or in an hour or to-morrow, kept his mind perpetually chained down to the consideration of visible and tangible and passing events, but now the cord of connection with land had been suddenly and completely severed. The very land itself was out of sight. Nothing around him tended to recall recent events, and as he had nothing in the world to do but wait until the voyage should come to an end, his mind was left free to bound over the recent past into the region of the long past, and revel there at pleasure. But Ned Sinton was not altogether without anxieties. He felt a little uneasy as to the high-handed manner in which he had carried off Nelly Morgan from her late guardian, and he was a good deal perplexed as to what the important affairs could be for which he had so hastily overturned all the gold-digging plans of his whole party. With these thoughts mingled many philosophic inquiries as to the amount of advantage that lay, if indeed there was any advantage at all, in making one's fortune suddenly and at the imminent hazard of one's life. Overpowering sleep at last put an end to Ned's wandering thoughts, and he too bade the stars good night and sought his pillow. In due course the vessel cast anchor off the town of San Francisco. There is many a slip 'tween the cup and the lip. It is an old proverb that, but one which is proved by frequent use on the part of authors in all ages to be a salutary reminder to humanity. Its truth was unpleasantly exemplified on the arrival of the steamer. As the tide was out at the time, the captain ordered the boats to be lowered in order to land the passengers. The moment they touched the water they were filled by impatient miners, who struggled to be the first ashore. The boat into which Ned and his friends got was soon overloaded with passengers, and the captain ordered it to be shoved off. "Hold on!" shouted a big, coarse-looking fellow in a rough blue jacket and wide awake, who was evidently drunk. "Let me in first." "There's no room," cried several voices. "Shove off." "There's room enough," cried the man with an oath, at the same time seizing the rope. "If you do come down," said a sailor sternly, "I'll pitch you overboard." "Will ya?" growled the man, and the next instant he sprang upon the edge of the boat, which upset and left its freight struggling in the water. The other boats immediately picked them all up, and, beyond getting a wetting, they were physically none the worse. But, alas! the bags of gold which our adventurers were carrying ashore with them sank to the bottom of the sea. They were landed on the wharf at San Francisco as penniless as they were on the day of their arrival in California. This reverse of fortune was too tremendous to be realised in a moment. As they stood on the wharf, dripping wet, and gazing at each other in dismay, they suddenly, as if by one consent, burst into a loud laugh. But the laugh had a strong dash of bitterness in its tone, and when it passed, the expression of their countenances was not cheerful. Bill Jones was the first to speak, as they wandered almost helplessly through the crowded streets, while little Nelly ever and anon looked wistfully up into Larry's face as he led her by the hand. "It's a stunnin' smash," said Bill, fetching a deep sigh. "But when a thing's done, and can't be undone, then it's unpossible, that's what it is, and what's unpossible there's no use o' tryin' for to do. 'Cause why? It only wastes your time and frets your spirit. That's my opinion." Not one of the party ventured to smile, as was their wont in happier circumstances, at the philosophy of their comrade's remark. They wandered on in silence till they reached, they scarce knew how or why, the centre plaza of the town. "It's of no use giving way to it," said Ned Sinton at last, making a mighty effort to recover. We must face our reverses like men, and after all it might have been worse. We might have lost our lives as well as our gold, so we ought to be thankful instead of depressed." "What shall we do now?" inquired Captain Bunting, in a tone that proved sufficiently that he at least could not benefit by Ned's advice. "Sure, we'll have to go and work, capting," replied Larry, in a tone of facetious desperation. "But first of all we'll have to go and see Mr Thompson, and get dry clothes for Nelly, poor thing. Are you cold, darling?" "No, not in the least," answered the child sadly. "I think my things will dry soon if we walk in the sun." Nelly's voice seemed to rouse the energies of the party more effectually than Ned's moralising. "Yes," cried the latter, "let us away to old Thompson's. His daughter Lizette will put you all to rights, dear, in a short time. Come along." So saying, Ned led the way, and the whole party speedily stood at the door of Mr Thompson's cottage. The door was merely fastened by a latch, and as no notice was taken of their first knock, Ned lifted it and entered the hall, then advancing to the parlour door, he opened it and looked in. The sight that met his gaze was well calculated to make him open his eyes, and his mouth too, if that would in any way have relieved his feelings. Seated in old Mr Thompson's easy chair, with one leg stretched upon an ottoman, and the other reposing on a stool, reclined Tom Collins, looking perhaps a little paler than was his wont, as if still suffering from the effects of a recent illness, but evidently quite happy and comfortable. Beside Tom, on another stool, with her arm resting on Tom's knee, and looking up in his face with a quiet smile, sat Elizabeth Thompson. "Tom! Miss Thompson!" cried Ned Sinton, standing absolutely aghast. Miss Thompson sprang up with a face of crimson, but Tom sat coolly still, and said, while a broad grin overspread his handsome countenance, "No, Ned, not Miss Thompson, Mrs Collins, who I know is rejoiced to see you." "You are jesting, Tom," said Ned, as he advanced quickly and took the lady's hand, while Tom rose and heartily welcomed his old companions. "Not a bit of it, my dear fellow," he repeated. "This, I assure you, is my wife. Pray, dear Lizette, corroborate my statement, else our friends won't believe me. But sit down, and let's hear all about you. Go, Lizette, get them something to eat. I knew you would make your appearance ere long. Old Thompson's letter Hallo! Why, what's this? You're wet. And who's this? A wet little girl?" "Faix, ye may well be surprised, Mr Tom," said Larry, "for we're all wet beggars, ivery one of us, without a dollar to bless ourselves with." Tom Collins looked perplexed as he turned from one to the other. "Stay," he shouted. "Wife, come here. There's a mystery going on. Take this moist little one to your room, and there," he added, throwing open a door, "you fellows will all find dry apparel to put on, though I don't say to fit. Come along with me, Ned, and while you change, give an account of yourself." Ned did as he was desired, and, in the course of a lengthened conversation, detailed to Tom the present condition of himself and his friends. "It's unfortunate," said Tom, after a pause. "Ill luck seems to follow us wherever we go." "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," cried Ned, "for saying so, considering the wife you have got." "True, my boy," replied the other. "I ought indeed to be ashamed, but I spoke in reference to money matters. What say you to the fact that I am as much a beggar as yourself?" "Outward appearances would seem to contradict you." "Nevertheless, it is true, I assure you. When you left me, Ned, in the hotel at Sacramento, I became so lonely that I grew desperate, and, feeling much stronger in body, I set off for this town in the new steamer, that in which you arrived. I came straight up here, reintroduced myself to Mr Thompson, and 2 days after, for I count it folly to waste time in such matters when one's mind is made up, I proposed to Lizette, and was accepted conditionally. Of course the condition was that papa should be willing, but papa was not willing. He said that $3,000, all I possessed, was a capital sum, but not sufficient to marry on, and that he could not risk his daughter's happiness, etcetera, etcetera, you know the rest. Well, the very next day news came that one of Thompson's best ships had been wrecked off Cape Horn. This was a terrible blow, for the old man's affairs were in a rickety condition at any rate, and this sank him altogether. His creditors were willing enough to wait, but one rascal refused to do so, and swore he would sequestrate him. I found that the sum due him was exactly $3,000, so I paid him the amount in full, and handed Thompson the discharged account. Now, said I, I'm off to the digging, so good-bye. For you see, Ned, I felt that I could not urge my suit at that time, as it would be like putting on the screw, taking an unfair advantage of him. Why, what do you mean, my lad? Said he. That I'm off to-morrow, replied I. That you must not do, said he. Why not? Said I. Because, said he, now that things are going smooth, I must go to England by the first ship that sails, and get my affairs there put on a better footing, so you must stay here to look after my business, and to take care of Lizette. What? Said I. What do you mean? You know that is impossible. Not at all, boy, if you marry her. Of course I could not refuse, and so, to cut it short, we were married right off, and here we are, the representatives of the great firm of Thompson and Company of California. Then, do you mean to say that Thompson is gone? Inquired Ned, with a look of horror. Near the Horn, I should think, by this time. But why so anxious? Because, sighed Ned, sitting down on the edge of the bed with a look of despair, I came here by his invitation, and— "Oh, it's all right," interrupted Tom. "I know all about it, and am commissioned by him to settle the affair for you." "But what is the affair?" inquired Ned, eagerly. "Ah, my dear boy, do try to exercise patience. If I tell you everything before we go down to our comrades, I fear we shall have to send a message to say that we are not coming till to-morrow morning." Tom rose as he spoke, and led the way to the parlour, where bread and cheese were spread out for them. "The only drawback to my felicity," whispered Tom to Sinton, as they entered, "is that I find Thompson's affairs far worse than he himself was aware of; and it's a fact that at this moment I can scarcely draw enough out of the business to supply the necessaries of life." There was a slight bitterness in Tom's tone as he said this, but the next moment he was jesting with his old companions as light-heartedly as ever. During the meal he refused, however, to talk business, and when it was concluded, he proposed that they should go out for a stroll through the town. "By the way," remarked Ned, as they walked along, "what of Captain Bunting's old ship?" "Ay," echoed the captain, "that's the uppermost thing in my mind, but Master Tom seems determined to keep us in the dark. I do believe the Roving Bess has been burned, and he's afraid to tell us." "You're a desperately inquisitive set," cried Tom Collins, laughing. "Could you not suppose that I wanted to give you a surprise by showing you how curiously she has been surrounded by houses since you last saw her? You'll think nothing of it, now that I have told you." "Why, where are you going?" cried Larry, as Tom turned up a street that led a little away from the shore, towards which they had been walking. Tom made no reply, but led on. They were now in that densely crowded part of the town where shops were less numerous, warehouses more plentiful, and disagreeable odours more abundant than elsewhere. A dense mass of buildings lay between them and the sea, and in the centre of these was a square or plaza, on one side of which stood a large hotel, out of the roof of which rose a gigantic flagstaff. A broad and magnificent flight of wooden steps led up to the door of this house of entertainment, over which, on a large board, was written its name, "The Roving Bess Tavern." "Dear me, that's a strange coincidence!" exclaimed the captain, as his eye caught the name. "Tearing ages!" yelled Larry, "if it isn't the old ship! Don't I know the mizzen mast as well as I know me right leg?" "The Roving Bess Tavern," muttered Captain Bunting, while his eyes stared incredulously at the remarkable edifice before him. Bill Jones, who up to this point had walked beside his comrades in silent meditation, here lost presence of mind, and, putting both hands to his mouth, sang out, in true stentorian boatswain tones, "All hands ahoy! Tumble up there! Tumble up!" "Ay, ay, sir," roared half a dozen jack tars, who chanced to be regaling themselves within, and who rushed out, hat in hand, ready for a spree at the unexpected but well-known summons. "Major Whitlaw," said Tom Collins, springing up the steps and addressing a tall, cadaverous-looking Yankee, "allow me to introduce you to your landlord, Captain Bunting. Your tenant, captain. I dare say you have almost forgotten each other." The captain held out his hand mechanically, and gazed at his tenant unbelievingly, while the Major said, "Glad to see you, captain, I guess. Wanted to for a long time. Couldn't come to terms with old Thompson. Won't you step in and take a cocktail or a gin sling? I'd like to have a private talk this way." The landlord of the Roving Bess Tavern led the captain to what was once his own cabin, and begged him to be seated on his own locker at the head of his own table. He accepted these civilities, staring round him in mute wonder all the time, as if he thought it was a dream, out of which he should wake in due course, while from all parts of the tavern came sounds of mirth, and clatter of knives and forks and dishes, and odours of gin slings and bear steaks and pork pies. "Jist sit there a minute," said the Yankee, "till I see to your friends being fixed off comfortable. Of course Mr Collins may stay, for he knows all about it." When he was gone, the captain rose and looked into his old berth. It had been converted into a pantry, so he shut the door quickly and returned to his seat. "Tom," said he, in a low whisper, as if he feared to break the spell, "how did they get her up here?" "She's never been moved since you left her," answered Tom, laughing. "The town has gradually surrounded her, as you see, and crept out upon the shore, filling up the sea with rubbish, till it has left her nearly a quarter of a mile inland." The captain's eyes opened wider than ever, but before he could find words again to speak, Major Whitlaw returned. "You're all square now, gentlemen, so, if you please, we'll proceed to business. I suppose your friend has told you how the land lies?" "He certainly has," replied the captain, who accepted the phrase literally. "Wall, I reckon your property's riz since you were here. Now, if you give me leave to make the alterations I want to, I'll give you $1,000 a month, payable in advance." "You'd better tell Captain Bunting what the alterations you refer to are," suggested Tom Collins, who saw that the captain's state of mind rendered him totally incapable of transacting business. "That's soon done. I'll give it you slick off. I want to cut away the companion hatch, and run up a regular stair to the deck. Then it's advisable to cut away at least half of the main deck, to heighten the gamin' saloon. But I guess the main point is to knock out half a dozen windows in the hold, for gaslight is plaguey dear when it's goin' full blast day and night. Besides, I must cut the entrance door down to the ground, for this tremendous flight of stairs'll be the ruin of the business. It's only a week since a man was shot by a comrade here in the cabin, and as they rushed out after him, 2 customers fell down the stair and broke their arms. And I calc'late the gentleman that's overtaken by liquor every night won't stand it much longer. There isn't a single man that quits this house after 12 p.m. but goes down that flight head foremost. If you don't sanction that change, I guess I'll have to get 'em padded, and spread feather beds at the foot. Now, captain, if you agrees to this right off, I'll give the sum named." Captain Bunting's astonishment had now reached that point at which extremes are supposed to meet, and a reaction began to take place. "How much did you propose?" he inquired, taking out a pencil and an old letter, as if he were about to make notes, at the same time knitting his brows, and endeavouring to look intensely sagacious. $1,000 a month," answered the Yankee. "I railly can't stand more." "Let me see," muttered the captain slowly, in an undertone, while he pressed his forehead with his forefinger. $1,000, £200 sterling. Equal to about £2,400 a year. Well," he added, raising his voice, "I don't mind if I do. I suppose, Tom, it's not much below the thing, as rents go." "It's a fair offer," said Tom, carelessly. "We might perhaps get a higher, but Major Whitlaw is in possession, and is, besides, a good tenant." "Then I'll conclude the bargain. Pray get pen, ink, and paper." While the Major turned for a moment to procure writing materials, the captain looked at Tom and winked expressively. Then a document was drawn up, signed, and witnessed, and then the captain, politely declining a brandy smash, or any other smash whatever, left the Roving Bess Tavern with his friends, and with £200, the first month's rent, in his pocket. It is needless to remark that his comrades congratulated him heartily, and that the worthy captain walked along the streets of San Francisco chuckling. In a few minutes Tom Collins stopped before a row of immense warehouses. There was one gap in the row, a space of several yards square, that might have held 2 good-sized houses. 4 wooden posts stood at the corners of the plot, and an old boat, turned keel up, lay in the middle of it. "I know it!" cried Ned Sinton, laughing in gleeful surprise. "It's my old boat, isn't it? Well, I can scarcely credit my eyes. I saw it last on the seashore, and now it's 1/4 of a mile into the town." "More than that, Ned," said Tom Collins. "The plot of ground is worth $10,000 at this moment. Had it been a little further south, it would have been worth 10 times that sum. And more than that still, the Irish family you lent the boat to, you remember them? Well, they dug up a bag from under the boat which contained $5,000. The honest people at once gave it up, and Mr Thompson rewarded them well, but they did not live to enjoy it long. They're all dead now. So you see, Ned, you're just £3,000 richer than you thought you were this morning." "It's a great day," remarked Larry O'Neil, looking round upon his comrades, who received all this information with an expression of doubting surprise. "A great day entirely. Faix, I'm only hoping we won't waken up and find it's all a drame." Larry's companions quite agreed with him. They did not indeed say so, but, as they returned home after that stroll, talking eagerly of future plans and prospects, the ever-recurring sentiment broke from their lips in every style of phrase, "It's a great day entirely." CHAPTер 27. Chapter 28 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 28. More unexpected discoveries. Captain Bunting makes Bill Jones a first mate. Larry O'Neil makes himself a first mate. The parting. Ned Sinton proves himself a second time to be a friend in need and indeed. "It never rains but it pours," saith the proverb. We are fond of proverbs. We confess to a weakness that way. There is a depth of meaning in them which courts investigation from the strongest intellects. Even when they are nonsensical, which is not infrequently the case, their nonsense is unfathomable, and therefore invested with all the zest which attaches, metaphysically speaking, to the incomprehensible. Astonishing circumstances have been reigning for some time past around our bewildered adventurers, and latterly they have begun to pour. On the afternoon of the day, the events of which have been recorded in the last chapter, there was, metaphorically speaking, a regular thunderplump. No sooner had the party returned to old Mr Thompson's cottage than down it came again, heavy as ever. On entering the porch, Lizette ran up to Tom in that pretty tripping style peculiar to herself, and whispered in his ear. "Well, you baggage," said he, "I'll go with you, but I don't like secrets. Walk into the parlour, friends. I'll be with you in a minute." "Tom," said Lizette, pursing up her little mouth and elevating her pert nose, "you can't guess what an interesting discovery I've made." "Of course I can't," replied Tom, with affected impatience. "Now, pray don't ask me to try, else I shall leave you instantly." "What an impatient creature you are," said Lizette. "Only think, I have discovered that my maid, whom we hired only 2 days ago, has—" "Bolted with the black cook or somebody else, and married him?" interrupted Tom, with a look of horror, as he threw himself into an easy chair. "Not at all," rejoined Lizette hurriedly. "Nothing of the sort. She has discovered that the little girl Mr Sinton brought with him is her sister." "What! Kate Morgan's sister?" cried Tom, with a look of surprise. "I knew it. I was sure I had heard the name before, but I couldn't remember when or where. I see it now. She must be the girl Larry O'Neil used to talk about up at the diggings. But as I never saw her there, of course I couldn't know her." "Well, I don't know about that. I suppose you're right," replied Lizette, "but isn't it nice? They're kissing and hugging each other and crying in the kitchen at this moment. Oh, I'm so happy, the dear little thing!" If Lizette was happy, she took a strange way to show it, for she sat down beside Tom and began to sob. While the above conversation was going on upstairs, another conversation, interesting enough to deserve special notice, was going on in the parlour. "Sure, don't I know me own feelin's best?" remarked Larry, addressing Ned Sinton. "It's all very well at the diggin's, but when it comes to drawin' rooms and parlours, I feels, and so does Bill Jones here, that we're out o' place. In the matter o' diggin' we're all equals, no doubt, but we feels that we ain't gintlemen born, and that it's awk'ard to the lady to be havin' such rough customers at her table. So Bill and me has agreed to make the most o' ourselves in the kitchen." "Larry, you're talking nonsense. We have messed together on equal terms for many months, and whatever course we may follow after this, you must sup with us to night as usual. I know Tom will be angry if you don't." "Ay, sir, but it ain't as usual," suggested Bill Jones, turning the quid in his cheek. "It's quite unusual for the likes o' us to sup with a lady." "That's it," chimed in Larry. "So, Mister Ned, you just plaise to make our excuses to Mrs Tom, and tell her where we've gone to locate, as the Yankees say. Come away, Bill." Larry took his friend by the arm, and, leading him out of the room, shut the door. 5 seconds after that there came an appalling female shriek, and a dreadful masculine yell from the region of the kitchen, accompanied by a subdued squeak of such extreme sweetness that it could have come only from the throat of Mademoiselle Nelina. Ned and the captain sprang to the door, and dashed violently against Tom and his wife, whom they unexpectedly met also rushing towards the kitchen. In another moment a curious and deeply interesting tableau vivant was revealed to their astonished gaze. In the middle of the room was Larry O'Neil, down on one knee, while with both arms he supported the fainting form of Kate Morgan. By Kate's side knelt her sister Nelly, who bent over her pale face with anxious, tearful countenance, while presiding over the group, like an amiable ogre, stood Bill Jones, with his hands in his breeches pockets, his legs apart, one eye tightly screwed up, and his mouth expanded from ear to ear. "That's your sort!" cried Bill, in ecstatic glee. "When a thing comes all right, and tight, and ship shape, why, what then? In course it's all square. That's what I say." "She's comin' to," whispered Larry. "Ah, then, spake, won't you, darlin'? It'll do you good, maybe, and help to open your two party eyes." Kate Morgan recovered we need scarcely tell our reader that and Nelly dried her eyes, and that evening was spent in a fashion that conduced to the well-being and comfort and good humour of all parties concerned. Perhaps it is also needless to inform our reader that Larry O'Neil and Bill Jones carried their point. They supped in the kitchen that night. Our informant does not say whether Kate Morgan and her sister Nelly supped with them, but we rather think they did. A week afterwards, Captain Bunting had matured his future plans. He resolved to purchase a clipper brig that was lying at that time useless in the harbour, and embark in the coasting trade of California. He made Bill Jones his first mate, and offered to make Larry O'Neil his second, but Larry wanted a mate himself, and declined the honour. So the captain gave him £500 to set him up in any line he chose. Ned Sinton sold his property, and also presented his old comrade with a goodly sum of money, saying that as he, Ned, had been the means of dragging him away from the diggings, he felt bound to assist him in the hour of need. So Kate Morgan became Mrs O'Neil the week following, and she, with her husband and her little sister, started off for the interior of the country to look after a farm. About the same time, Captain Bunting, having completed the lading of his brig, succeeded in manning her by offering a high wage, and, bidding adieu to Ned and Tom, set sail for the Sacramento. 2 days afterwards, Ned got a letter from old Mr Shirley, the first that he had received since leaving England. It began thus: "My dearest boy, what has become of you? I have written 6 letters at least, but have never got a single line in reply. You must come home immediately, as affairs here require your assistance, and I'm getting too old to attend to business matters." Do come at once, my dear Ned, unless you wish me to reprove you. Moxon says only a young and vigorous man of business can manage things properly, but when I mentioned you, he shook his head gravely. Too wild and absurd in his notions, said he. I stopped him, however, by saying that I was fully aware of your faults." The letter then went rambling on in a quaint, prosy, but interesting style, and Ned sat long in his room in old Mr Thompson's cottage, poring over its contents, and gradually maturing his future plans. "It's awkward," soliloquized he, resting his head on both hands. "I shall have to go at once, and so won't have a chance of seeing Bunting again, to tell him of poor Tom's circumstances. He would only be too glad to give him a helping hand, but I know Tom will never let him know how hard up he is. There's nothing else for it," he added determinedly. "My uncle will laugh at my profitless tour, but n'importe, I have learned much. Come in." This last remark was addressed to some one who had tapped gently at the door. "It's only me, Ned. Can I come in? I fear I interrupt you," said Tom, as he entered the room. "Not at all. Sit down, my boy. I have just been perusing a letter from my good old Uncle Shirley. He writes so urgently that I fear I must return to England by the first homeward bound ship." "Return to England!" exclaimed Tom in surprise. "What, leave the goldfields just as the sun is beginning to shine on you?" "Even so, Tom." "My dear Ned, you are mad. This is a splendid country. Just see what fortunes we should have made, but for the unfortunate accidents that have happened." Tom sighed as he spoke. "I know it," replied his friend with sudden energy. "This is a splendid country. Gold exists all over it, not only in the streams, but on the hillsides, and even on hill tops, as you and I know from personal experience. But gold, Tom, is not everything in this world, and the getting of it should not be our chief aim. Moreover, I have come to the conclusion that digging gold ought to be left entirely to such men as are accustomed to dig ditches and throw up railway embankments. Men whose intelligence is of a higher order ought not to ignore the faculties that have been given to them, and devote their time, too often, alas, their lives, to a species of work that the merest savage is equally capable of performing. Navvies may work at the mines with propriety, but educated men who devote themselves to such work are, I fear, among the number of those to whom Scripture specially speaks when it says, `Make not haste to be rich.'" "But there are other occupations here besides digging for gold," said Tom. "I know it, and I would be happy and proud to rank among the merchants and engineers and such men of California, but duty calls me home, and, to say truth," added Ned with a smile, "inclination points the way." Tom Collins still for some time attempted to dissuade his friend from quitting the country, and his sweet little wife Lizette seconded his efforts with much earnestness, but Ned Sinton was immovable. He took passage in the first ship that sailed for England. The night before he sailed, Ned, after retiring to his room for the last time in his friend's house, locked his door, and went through a variety of little pieces of business that would have surprised his hosts had they seen him. He placed a large strong box on the table, and cautiously drew from under his bed a carpet bag, which, from the effort made to lift it, seemed to be filled with some weighty substance. Unlocking the bag, he proceeded to lift out handful after handful of shining dollars and gold pieces, interspersed here and there with massive nuggets. These he transferred into the wooden box until it was full. This was nearly the whole of Ned's fortune. It amounted to a little more than 3,000 pounds sterling. Having completed the transfer, Ned counted the surplus left in the bag, and found it to be about 500 pounds. This he secured in a leather purse, and then sat down to write a letter. The letter was short when finished, but it took him long to write, for he meditated much during the writing of it, and several times laid his head on his hands. At last it was completed, put into the box, and the lid screwed down above it. Then Ned read a chapter in the Bible, as was his wont, and retired to rest. Next day Tom and Lizette stood on the wharf to see him embark for England. Long and earnest was the converse of the two friends, as they were about to part, probably for ever, and then, for the first time, they became aware how deep was the attachment which each had formed for the other. At last the mate of the ship came up and touched his hat. "Now, sir, boat's ready, sir, and we don't wish to lose the first of the ebb." "Good-bye, Lizette. Good-bye, Tom. God be with and bless you, my dear fellow. Stay, I had almost forgotten. Tom, you will find a box on the table in my room. You can keep the contents. A letter in it will explain. Farewell." Tom's heart was too full to speak. He squeezed his friend's hand in silence, and, turning hurriedly around, walked away with Lizette the instant the boat left the shore. Late in the evening, Tom and his wife remembered the box, and went upstairs to open it. Their surprise at its rich contents may be imagined. Both at once understood its meaning, and Lizette sat down and covered her face with her hands to hide the tears that flowed, while her husband read the letter. It ran thus: "My dearest Tom, you must not be angry with me for leaving this trifle. It is a trifle compared with the amount of gold I would give you if I had it, but I need not apologise. The spirit of love in which it is given demands that it shall be unhesitatingly received in the same spirit. May God, who has blessed us and protected us in all our wanderings together, cause your worldly affairs to prosper, and especially may He bless your soul. Seas and continents may separate us, but I shall never forget you, Tom, or your dear wife. But I must not write as if I were saying farewell. I intend this epistle to be the opening of a correspondence that shall continue as long as we live. You shall hear from me again ere long. Your sincerely attached friend, Edward Sinton." At the time Tom Collins was reading the above letter to Lizette in a broken, husky voice, our hero was seated on the taffrail of the ship that bore him swiftly over the sea, gazing wistfully at the receding shore, and bidding a final adieu to California and all his golden dreams. Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 29. Our story comes to an end. Home. What a host of old and deep and heart-stirring associations arise in every human breast at the sound of that old familiar word. How well we know it, how vividly it recalls certain scenes and faces, how pleasantly it falls on the ear and slips from the tongue. Yet how little do we appreciate home until we have left it and longed for it, perhaps for many years. Our hero, Ned Sinton, is home at last. He sits in his old place beside the fire, with his feet on the fender. Opposite to him sits old Mr Shirley, with a bland smile on his kind, wrinkled visage, and 2 pairs of spectacles on his brow. Mr Shirley, as we formerly stated, regularly loses 1 pair of spectacles, and always searches for them in vain, in consequence of his having pushed them too far up on his bald head. He therefore is frequently compelled to put on his 2nd pair, and hence makes a spectacle to some extent of himself. Exactly between the uncle and the nephew, on a low stool, sits the cat par excellence, Mr Shirley's cat, a creature which he has always been passionately fond of since it was a kitten, and to which, after Ned's departure for California, he had devoted himself so tenderly that he felt half ashamed of himself, and would not like to have been asked how much he loved it. Yes, the cat sits there, looking neither at old Mr Shirley nor at young Mr Sinton, but bestowing its undivided attentions and affections on the fire, which it enjoys extremely, if we may judge from the placid manner in which it winks and purrs. Ned has been a week at home, and he has just reached that point of experience at which the wild life of the diggings through which he has passed begins to seem like a vivid dream rather than reality. Breakfast had just been concluded, although the cloth had not yet been removed. "Do you know, uncle," remarked Ned, settling his bulky frame more comfortably in the easy chair, and twirling his watch key, I find it more difficult every day to believe that the events of the last few months of my life have actually occurred. When I sit here in my old seat and look at you and the cat and the furniture, everything, in fact, just the same as when I left, I cannot realize that I have been nearly 2 years away." "I understand your feelings, my dear boy," replied Mr Shirley, taking off his spectacles, the lower pair, wiping them with his handkerchief, putting them on again, and looking over them at his nephew with an expression of unmitigated admiration. "I can sympathise with you, Ned, for I have gone through the same experience more than once in the course of my life. It's a strange life, boy, a very strange life this, as you'll come to know if you're spared to be as old as I am." Ned thought that his knowledge was already pretty extended in reference to life, and even flattered himself that he had had some stranger views of it than his uncle, but he prudently did not give expression to his thoughts, and after a short pause Mr Shirley resumed. "Yes, lad, it's a very strange life, and the strangest part of it is, that the longer we live the stranger it gets. I travelled once in Switzerland." The old gentleman paused, as if to allow the statement to have its full weight on Ned's youthful mind. "And it's a curious fact that when I had been some months there, home and all connected with it became like a dream to me, and Switzerland became a reality. But after I came back to England, and had spent some time here, home again became the reality, and Switzerland appeared like a dream, so that I sometimes said to myself, can it be possible that I have been there? Very odd, isn't it?" "It is, uncle, and I have very much the same feelings now." "Very odd indeed," repeated Mr Shirley. "By the way, that reminds me that we have to talk about that farm of which I spoke to you on the day of your arrival." We might feel surprised that the above conversation could in any way have the remotest connection with that farm of which Mr Shirley was so suddenly reminded, did we not know that the subject was, in fact, never out of his mind. "True, uncle, I had almost forgotten about it; but you know I've been so much engaged during the last few days in visiting my old friends and college companions, that—" I know it, Ned, and I don't want to bother you with business matters sooner than I can help, but—" "My dear uncle, how can you for a moment suppose that I could be bothered by—" "Of course not, boy," interrupted Mr Shirley. "Well, now, let me ask you, Ned, how much gold have you brought back from the diggings?" Ned fidgeted uncomfortably on his seat. The subject could no longer be avoided. I must confess," said he with hesitation, "that I haven't brought much. Of course, you couldn't be expected to have done much in so short a time. But how much?" "Only £500," replied Ned with a sigh, while a slight blush shone through the deep bronze of his countenance. "Oh," said Mr Shirley, pursing up his mouth, while an arch twinkle lurked in the corners of each eye. "Ah, but, uncle, you mustn't quiz me. I had more, and might have brought it home too, if I had chosen." "Then why didn't you?" Ned replied to this question by detailing how most of his money had been lost, and how, at the last, he gave nearly all that remained to his friend Tom Collins. "You did quite right, Ned, quite right," said Mr Shirley, when his nephew had concluded. "And now I'll tell you what I want you to do. You told me the other day, I think, that you wished to become a farmer." "Yes, uncle, I do think that that life would suit me better than any other. I'm fond of the country and a quiet life, and I don't like cities. But then I know nothing about farming, and I doubt whether I should succeed without being educated to it to some extent at least." "A very modest and proper feeling to entertain," said Mr Shirley with a smile, "particularly when it is considered that farming is an exceedingly difficult profession to acquire a knowledge of. But I have thought of that for you, Ned, and I think I see a way out of the difficulty." "What way is that?" "I won't tell you just yet, boy; but answer me this. Are you willing to take any farm I suggest to you, and henceforth to give up all notion of wandering over the face of the earth, and devote yourself steadily to your new profession?" "I am, uncle, if you will point out to me how I am to pay the rent and stock the farm, and how I am to carry it on in the meantime without a knowledge of husbandry." "I'll do that for you, all in good time. Meanwhile, will you put on your hat and run down to Moxton's office? You remember it?" "That I do," replied Ned, with a smile. "Well, go there and ask him for the papers I wrote about to him 2 days ago. Bring them here as quickly as you can. We shall then take the train and run down to Brixley and look at the farm." "But are you really in earnest?" asked Ned, in some surprise. "Never more so in my life," replied the old gentleman, mildly. "Now be off. I want to read the paper." Ned rose and left the room, scarcely believing that his uncle did not jest. As he shut the door, old Mr Shirley took up the paper, pulled down the upper pair of spectacles, an act which knocked the lower pair off his nose, whereat he smiled more blandly than ever, and began to read. Meanwhile Edward Sinton put on his greatcoat, the identical one he used to wear before he went away, and his hat and his gloves, and walked out into the crowded streets of London, with feelings somewhat akin probably to those of a somnambulist. Having been so long accustomed to the free and easy costume of the mines, Ned felt about as uncomfortable and stiff as a warrior of old must have felt when armed cap a pie. His stalwart frame was somewhat thinner and harder than when he last took the same walk. His fair moustache and whiskers were somewhat more decided and less like wreaths of smoke, and his countenance was of a deep brown colour. But in other respects Ned was the same dashing fellow that he used to be. Dashing by nature, we may remark, not by affectation. In half an hour he stood before Moxton's door. There it was, as large as life and as green as ever. Ned really found it impossible to believe that it was so long since he last saw it. He felt as if it had been yesterday. The brass knocker and the brass plate were there too, as dirty as ever, perhaps a thought dirtier, and the dirty house still retreated a little behind its fellows, and was still as much ashamed of itself, seemingly, as ever. Ned raised the knocker and smote the brass knob. The result was, as formerly, a disagreeable looking old woman, who replied to the question, "Is Mr Moxton in?" with a sharp, short "Yes." The dingy little office, with its insufficient allowance of daylight, and its compensating mixture of yellow gas, was inhabited by the same identical small dishevelled clerk who, nearly 2 years before, was busily employed in writing his name interminably on scraps of paper, and who now, as then, answered to the question, "Can I see Mr Moxton?" by pointing to the door which opened into the inner apartment, and resuming his occupation the same occupation writing his name on scraps of paper. Ned tapped, as of yore. "Come in," cried a stern voice, as of ditto. Ned entered, and there, sure enough, was the same tall, gaunt man, with a sour cast of countenance, standing, as formerly, with his back to the fire. "Ah!" exclaimed Moxton, "you're young Sinton, I suppose?" Ned almost started at the perfect reproduction of events, and questions, and answers. He felt a species of reckless incredulity in reference to everything steal over him as he replied, "Yes, I came at my uncle's request for some papers that "Ah, yes, they're all ready," interrupted the lawyer, advancing to the table. "Tell your uncle that I shall be glad to hear from him again in reference to the subject of those papers, and take care of them. They are of value. Good morning." "Good morning," replied our hero, retreating. "Stay," said Moxton. Ned stopped, and turned round. "You've been in California since I last saw you, I understand?" "I have," replied Ned. "You haven't made your fortune, I fancy?" "No, not quite." "It's a wild place, if all reports are true." "Rather," replied Ned, smiling. "There's a want of law there." "Ha! and lawyers," remarked Moxton, sarcastically. "Indeed there is," replied Ned, with some enthusiasm, as he thought of the gold hunting spirit that prevailed in the cities of California. "There is great need out there of men of learning, men who can resist the temptation to collect gold, and are capable of doing good to the colony in an intellectual and spiritual point of view. Clergymen, doctors, and lawyers are much wanted there. You'd find it worth your while to go, sir." Had Edward Sinton advised Mr Moxton to go and rent an office on the Moon, he could scarcely have surprised that staid gentleman more than he did by this suggestion. The lawyer gazed at him for one moment in amazement. Then he said, "These papers are of value, young man. Be careful of them. Good morning," and sat down at his desk to write. Ned did not venture to reply, but instantly retired, and found himself in the street with, not as formerly an indistinct, but a distinct impression that he had heard the dishevelled clerk chuckling vociferously as he passed through the office. That afternoon Ned and old Mr Shirley alighted from the train at a small village not 100 miles out of London, and wended their way leisurely, for it was a warm sunny day for the season, towards a large, quaint old farmhouse, about 2 miles distant from the station. "What a very pleasant-looking house that is on the hill top," remarked Ned as he gave his arm to his uncle. "Do you think so? Well, I'm glad of it, because that's the farm I wish you to take." "Indeed!" exclaimed Ned in surprise. "Surely the farm connected with such a house must be a large one." "So it is," replied the other. Ned laughed. "My dear uncle," said he, "how can I manage such a place without means or knowledge?" "I said before, boy, that I would overcome both these difficulties for you." "You did, dear uncle, and if you were a rich man I could understand how you might overcome the first, but you have often told me you had no money in the world except the rent of a small property." "Right, Ned, I said so, and I say it again. I shan't leave you a sixpence when I die, and I can't afford to give you one while I am alive." "Then I must just leave the matter in your own hands," replied Ned, smiling, "for I cannot comprehend your plans." They had now reached the gate of the park that surrounded the fine old building of Brixley Hall. The house was one of those rambling, picturesque old mansions, which, although not very large in reality, have a certain air of magnitude and even grandeur about them. The windows were modern and large, so that the rooms were well lighted, and the view in all directions was magnificent. Wherever the eye turned it met knolls and mounds and fields and picturesque groves, with here and there a substantial farmsteading, or a little hamlet, with its modest church spire pointing ever upwards to the bright sky. Cattle and sheep lowed and bleated in the meadows, while gentle murmurs told that a rivulet flowed along its placid course at no great distance. The spot was simply enchanting, and Ned said so in the fulness of his heart emphatically. "'Tis a sweet spot," remarked his uncle, in a low, sad tone, as he entered the open door of the dwelling and walked deliberately into the drawing room. "Now, Ned, sit down, here opposite that window, where you can see the view, and I'll tell you how we shall manage. You tell me you have £500. "Yes, uncle." "Well, your dear mother left you her fortune when she died. It amounts to the small sum of £200. I never told you of it before, my boy, for reasons of my own. That makes £700. "Will that suffice to stock and carry on so large a farm?" inquired Ned. "Not quite," replied Mr Shirley, "but the farm is partly stocked already, so it'll do. Now, I've made arrangements with the proprietor to let you have it for the first year or two rent free. His last tenant's lease happens to have expired 6 months ago, and he is anxious to have it let immediately." Ned opened his eyes very wide at this. "He says," continued the old gentleman, "that if you can't manage to make the two ends meet in the course of a year or two, he will extend the gratis lease." Ned began to think his uncle had gone deranged. "Why, what do you mean?" said he. "Who is this extraordinary proprietor?" "He's an eccentric old fellow, Ned, who lives in London. They call him Shirley, I believe." "Yourself, uncle?" cried Ned, starting up. Dear reader, the conversation that followed was so abrupt, exclamatory, interjectional, and occasionally ungrammatical, as well as absurd, that it could not be reduced to writing. We therefore leave it to your imagination. After a time the uncle and nephew subsided, and again became sane. "But," said Ned, "I shall have to get a steward is that what you call him? An overseer, to manage affairs until I am able to do it myself." "True, Ned, but I have provided one already." "Indeed! But I might have guessed that. What shall I have to pay him? A good round sum, I suppose." "No," replied Mr Shirley, "he is very moderate in his expectations. He only expects his food and lodging, besides a little care, and attention, and love, particularly in his old age. "He must be a cautious fellow to look so far forward," said Ned, laughing. "What's his name?" "His name is Shirley." "What! yourself again?" "And why not, nephew? I've as much right to count myself fit to superintend a farm as you had, a year ago, to think yourself able to manage a gold mine. Nay, I have a better right, for I was a farmer the greater part of my life before I went to reside in London. Now, boy, as I went to live in the great city, which I don't like, in order to give you a good education, I expect that you'll take me to the country, which I do like, to be your overseer. I was born and bred here, Ned. This was my father's property, and when I am gone it shall be yours. It is not much to boast of. You won't be able to spend an idle life of it here, for, although a goodly place, it must be carefully tended if you would make it pay." "I don't need to tell you," replied Ned, "that I have no desire to lead an idle life; but, uncle, I think your terms are very high." "How so, boy?" "Love is a very high price to pay for service," replied Ned. "Your kindness and your generosity in this matter make me very happy and very grateful, and, perhaps, might make me very obedient and extremely attentive, but I cannot give you love at any price. I must refuse you as an overseer; but if you will come to me as old Uncle Shirley—" "Well, well, Ned," interrupted the old gentleman, with a benign smile, "we'll not dispute about that. Let us now go and take a run around the grounds." It is needless, dear reader, to prolong our story. Perchance we have taxed your patience too much already, but we cannot close without a word or two regarding the subsequent life of those whose fortunes we have followed so long. Ned Sinton and old Mr Shirley applied themselves with diligence and enthusiasm to the cultivation of their farm, and to the cultivation of the friendship and good will of their neighbours all round. In both efforts they were eminently successful. Ned made many interesting discoveries during his residence at Brixley Hall, chief among which was a certain Louisa Leslie, with whom he fell desperately in love, so desperately that his case was deemed hopeless. Louisa therefore took pity on him, and became Mrs Sinton, to the unutterable delight of old Mr Shirley and the cat, both of whom benefited considerably by this addition to the household. About the time this event occurred, Ned received a letter from Tom Collins, desiring him to purchase a farm for him as near to his own as possible. Tom had been successful as a merchant, and had made a large fortune, as was often the case in those days, in the course of a year or two. At first, indeed, he had had a hard struggle, and was more than once nearly driven by desperation to the gaming table, but Ned's advice and warnings came back upon him again and again, so he fought against the temptation manfully, and came off victorious. Improved trade soon removed the temptation. Perhaps we should say that his heavenly Father took that means to remove it, and at last, as we have said, he made a fortune, as many had done in like circumstances before him. Ned bought a farm 3 miles from his own, and in the course of a few months Tom and he were once more walking together, arm in arm, recalling other days, and arguing. Lizette and Louisa drew together like two magnets the instant they met, but the best of it was, Tom had brought home Larry O'Neil as his butler, and Mrs Kate O'Neil as his cook, while Nelly became his wife's maid. Larry, it seems, had not taken kindly to farming in California, the more so that he pitched unluckily on an unproductive piece of land, which speedily swallowed up his little fortune, and refused to yield any return. Larry, therefore, like some men who thought themselves much wiser fellows, pronounced the country a wretched one, in reference to agriculture, and returned to San Francisco, where he found Tom Collins prospering and ready to employ himself and his family. As butler to an English squire, Larry O'Neil was, according to his own statement, "a continted man." May he long remain so. Nelly Morgan soon became, out of sight, the sweetest girl in the countryside, and ere long one of the best young fellows in the district carried her off triumphantly, and placed her at the head of affairs in his own cottage. We say he was one of the best young fellows, this husband of Nelly's, but he was by no means the handsomest. Many a handsome, strapping youth there failed to obtain so good a wife as Nelly. Her husband was a steady, hard-working, thriving, good man, and quite good-looking enough for her, so Nelly said. As for Captain Bunting and Bill Jones, they stuck to each other to the last, like two limpets, and both of them stuck to the sea like fish. No shore-going felicities could tempt these hardy sons of Neptune to forsake their native element again. He had done it once, Bill Jones said, in one of the splendidest countries going, where gold was to be had for the picking up, and all sorts of eggs and rheumatisms for nothing. But when things didn't somehow go all square, and the anchor got foul with a gale o' adverse circumstances springin' up astarn, why, what then? Go to sea again, of course, and stick to it. Them was his sentiments. As these were also Captain Bunting's sentiments, they naturally took to the same boat for life. But, although Captain Bunting and Bill did not live on shore, they occasionally, at long intervals, condescended to revisit the terrestrial globe, and at such seasons of weakness made a point of running down to Brixley Hall to see Ned and Tom. Then, indeed, the light of other days shone again in retrospect on our adventurers with refulgent splendour. Then Larry sank the butler and came out as the miner, as one of the partners of the R'yal Bank o' Californy. Then Ned and Tom related marvellous adventures to the admiration of their respective wives, and the captain smote his thigh with frequency and emphasis to the terror of the cat, and Bill Jones gave utterance to deeply pregnant sentences, and told how that, on his last voyage to China, he had been up at Pekin, and had heard the Ah wow had dug up a nugget of gold 3 times the size of his own head, and had returned to his native land a millionaire, and had been made a mandarin, and after that something else, and at last became Prime Minister of China. So Bill had been told, but he couldn't vouch for it, nohow. All this and a great deal more was said and done on these great and rare occasions, and our quondam gold hunters fought their battles o'er again, to the ineffable delight of old Mr Shirley, who sat in his easy chair and gazed and smiled and stared, and laughed, and even wept, and chuckled, but never spoke. He was past that. In the course of time, Ned and Tom became extremely intimate with the pastor of their village, and were at last his right and left hand men. This pastor was a man whose aim was to live as his master had lived before him. He went about doing good, and of all the happy years our two friends spent, the happiest were those in which they followed in the footsteps and strengthened the hands of this good man. Lizette and Louisa were helpmates to their husband in this respect, as in all others, and a blessing to the surrounding country. Ned Sinton's golden dream was over now, in one sense, but by no means over in another. His sleeping and his waking dreams were still, as of old, tinged with the golden hue, but they had not a metallic ring. The golden rule was the foundation on which his new visions were reared, and that which we are told is better than gold, yea, than much fine gold, was thenceforth eagerly sought for and coveted by him. As for other matters, he delighted chiefly in the sunshine of Louisa's smile, and in fields of golden grain. The End. End of chapter 29. End of The Golden Dream.